Every god in Greece got a throne. Hades got the one kingdom nobody wanted, and a job with no end and no visitors. How a god ends up ruling the dead starts in the dark, inside his own father's body. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we step into the shadowed life of Hades, lord of the dead, from a newborn god swallowed whole and kept alive in the dark, to a lottery that split the universe three ways, to a three-headed dog guarding a gate that only opens one way. Before we sink in, one small thing. If these nights help you, a like and a subscribe mean a lot. No pressure. Only if it feels earned. And drop a comment. Which city are you in tonight? And what time is it there? I read every one. It's my favorite part of this, all right? Lights low. Fan on. If you like that soft hum. Get heavy. Get comfortable. Tonight's story starts now. You are minutes old, and the whole world smells like cold stone and crushed herbs. Someone has wrapped you in wool that still remembers the animal it came from. The wool smells faintly of smoke. Your mother's hands are shaking, and it is not from the cold. A shadow leans over you, the size of a doorway. It does not say anything. Somewhere outside, a river runs over stones, and it keeps running, because nothing in the world has noticed yet. Then the light goes out, and the only sound left in the universe is a heartbeat the size of a hill, beating somewhere on the other side of you. You do not cry. Later, that will be the thing everyone remembers about you. The shadow had a name, Cronus, king of the Titans, ruler of the Golden Age, and quietly the most frightened creature in the universe. Nobody looks frightened when they are that large. That is the trick of enormous power. It hides the shaking underneath. To understand why a father swallows his own children, you have to go back one generation. To the night Cronus became a king. His own father held the sky. Onas. He held it the way some people hold a job they never wanted, badly, and with resentment toward everyone who reminded him of it. And his children reminded him constantly. They were strange and enormous, and they had opinions. So he pushed them back down into the earth, down into their mother, and he held them there, and he told himself it was fine. She could feel every one of them. Imagine your body being used as a storage unit by someone who says the rent situation is complicated. That was her life for a very long time. So she made a blade out of gray flint, and she called her sons together, and she asked. Every one of them looked at the floor. Titans, immense as mountains, suddenly very interested in their own feet, except one. Cronus said yes. Cronus took the flint, and in one motion that the Greeks were still whispering about 1,000 years later, he separated the sky from the earth and put himself on the throne. His father did not die. Gods rarely have that option. Instead, as he pulled back from the world, Oonuz left his son a sentence. Not a curse exactly, more like an invoice with a very long payment window. A child of yours will do to you exactly what you've done to me. You know the feeling when someone says a thing in an argument that you cannot unhear? It sits in your chest for weeks. It surfaces while you are brushing your teeth. Now imagine that sentence is a prophecy, and prophecies in Greece never miss. The Titans did not inherit a kingdom that night. They inherited a warning, and one of them had to carry it. Cronus carried it for centuries. He built a world while carrying it. And the world he built was by every account, beautiful. Historians of myth called it the Golden Age. No winter, no labor, no aging, rivers that ran warm, fruit that grew without anyone asking it to, meals that arrived without a shopping list, a receipt, or a single argument about what everyone felt like eating. He married his sister, Rei, which was standard practice among Titans, and should not be examined too closely. She was patient in the way that mountains are patient, and for a while they were happy in the enormous, echoing way that immortals are happy. Then she told him she was pregnant, and Cronus did the math. He had spent his whole reign feeling the sentence sitting in his chest, and now here it came, wrapped in wool and about to be handed to him. The first child arrived at the end of a long night. Hesty. Oh? A daughter. Quiet from the first breath, Rhea held her for a moment. Just one. Long enough to notice she had a full head of hair. Then Cronus reached out, and he swallowed his daughter whole. And he did it without changing expression. Here is the part that makes this story strange instead of simply grim. She did not die. She could not die. That is the whole problem with immortality, and nobody had bothered to think it through. So she was alive inside him, awake, fully herself, somewhere in a dark that had no edges and no exit. Rhea did not scream. She learned something instead, and she filed it away. The second daughter came a few years later. Meet her, who would one day make wheat grow out of dead ground. Cronus swallowed her too. Then Hera, who came out already looking like she disapproved of the arrangement. Same result. 3 daughters. 3 swallows. He was getting efficient about it. And efficiency in a father is not always a virtue. People say it is. By now, he had a routine. He would wait outside the birth chamber. He would listen, and when the crying started, he would walk in with the calm of a man collecting a package. He had turned parenthood into inventory management. Everything accounted for. Nothing out in the world where it might grow up. And every single time, he told himself the same thing. This is not cruelty. This is caution. That is the lie that every frightened, powerful man tells himself. And it has never once been true. Then came the 4th, a son. The prophecy had been specific about that. Not a child, a son. And Cronus had been waiting for this particular night, since before the mountains had names. Rhea gave birth in a hall of gray stone with the shutters closed. There was a bowl of water going cold beside her. There was a smell of crushed herbs and animal fat from the lamps. And there was a boy, dark-haired, silent, looking at the ceiling with an expression that did not belong on something 4 minutes old. The Greeks would eventually call him Hades. Tonight, he was nameless, and he was already the most dangerous thing his father had ever held. Rhea asked for an hour. Just an hour. Cronus said no, and he said it gently, which somehow made it worse. He told her he loved the boy. He may even have meant it. Then the light went out, and the 4th child joined his sisters. And that is the answer to a question people rarely think to ask. Hades was not the last of the 6. He was the 4th, and the first son, which means that of the 3 brothers who would one day divide the entire universe between them, Hades went into the dark first, and he stayed there longest. Everything he becomes later starts in those years. Not with a throne, not with a crown, with a waiting room, and I want to sit inside that for a moment, because nobody ever does picture the worst waiting room ever built. No clock on the wall, no magazines, no reception desk, and nobody is ever going to call your name, except it is not a room. It has no walls to lean against and no floor to sit on. There is only the warmth and the endless, slow drum of a heartbeat that is not yours. Now stay there. Not for an afternoon. For generations. If you have ever lain awake at 3 in the morning with the house completely quiet and your own thoughts extremely loud, you have visited a very small suburb of that place. You went home in the morning. He did not. His sisters were there with him. That part gets left out of most retellings, and it is the warmest detail in the whole story. 4 children in the dark, unable to grow, unable to leave, unable to stop existing. And someone has to hold that together. The oldest daughter was quiet. The second was gentle. The third was already angry, and her anger would eventually reshape half of Greece. And the boy who had been there, fourth, found himself doing the strangest job in creation. He kept order in a place with nothing to order, not because anyone appointed him, because he had been there long enough to learn the shape of it, and the others had not. That is a habit, and when habits become deeply ingrained, they become part of who you are. That is a habit, and habits and gods eventually become a job description. Then the 5th child came, and the dark got a little louder. Poseidon arrived furious. He arrived the way the sea arrives, all at once, complaining about the accommodation, kicking at walls that were not there. The story does not tell us how Hades felt about that, but every older sibling listening tonight has a fairly precise idea. 5 of them now. 2 brothers, 3 sisters, all of them awake, all of them stuck. And here is the question I want you to keep hold of, because we will not answer it for a while. What exactly does a god become after that long in the dark? Not damaged, not evil. Something else, something the Greeks never had a clean word for. Hold that. It will pay off, and it will not pay off tonight, because outside the world was gorgeous. That is the cruelty of it. While 5 gods sat inside a dark with no edges, the golden age went on turning above them. Rivers ran warm over pale stones. Nymphs argued about nothing in the shade of trees that never dropped their leaves. In the great hall, the Titans ate and drank and told the same stories they had been telling for centuries. And nobody mentioned the children, not once. Not at a single feast. Everyone knew. Everyone found something else to look at, which is a very old human trick, and apparently a very old divine one too. Rhea sat through those feasts. She smiled where smiling was expected. She passed the wine. And then she went out to the cold edge of the terrace and stood there with her hands on the stone, doing arithmetic that no mother should ever have to do, because she was pregnant again. The 6th. Something in her had finally gone past grief and out the other side into something much more useful. She did not confront her husband. She did not beg. Begging had a track record of exactly 0 for 4 straight children. Instead, she went to the 2 people who understood him best. Her mother, who was the earth itself, and her father, who was still sulking somewhere behind the stars with a grudge, and excellent timing. And they gave her a plan. The plan had 2 parts, and both of them depended on the single truest thing about Cronus. He never checked. He had never checked anything in his life. He had swallowed 4 children without once looking closely at their faces. That is not the behavior of a careful king. That is the behavior of a man in a hurry to stop being afraid. To stop being afraid. So Rhea left in the night, and she went south, over water, to a lone green island the Greeks called Crete. There is a mountain there, and in that mountain there is a cave. It smells of wet limestone and old smoke. Water beads on the ceiling and lets go 1 drop at a time into a pool that has been there since before anyone was counting. That is where she had her 6th child. On cold rock, in the dark, alone, with only the dripping for company. A boy, loud from the first second. Absolutely nothing like his older brother. Zeus. She wrapped him in cloth. She fed him, and then she did the hardest thing in this entire story, which is that she put him down and walked away from him, because the second half of the plan was waiting back home, and it weighed about as much as a newborn god. She found a stone, a river stone, smooth and gray, and she wrapped it in swaddling cloth with the same care she would have used on the real thing. Then she carried it north, into the hall, past the Titans and the wine and the stories, and she handed her husband a rock. And Cronus swallowed it. He did not check. That is the whole reign of Cronus. In 3 words, he never checked. He spent an age of the world terrified of one specific outcome, and he could not be bothered to look at what he was holding. Fear makes you fast. It almost never makes you careful. Back on Crete, the newest god in the universe started crying the way newborns do at volume in a cave. On an island his father could reach in an afternoon. So they built him a security detail out of noise. Young warriors called the Kuretes stood outside that cave and clashed their bronze shields together, and stamped and shouted and danced. Hour after hour, day after day, an entire armed unit whose only assignment was to be louder than a baby. A goat fed him. The Greeks named her, which tells you they took her seriously, Amalthea, whose milk raised a king, and whose horn ended up as a symbol of endless plenty. Not bad for a goat. Bees brought honey. Nymphs rocked the cradle. The mountain kept its mouth shut, and Zeus grew, out in the light, with warm milk and open sky and the sound of bronze in his ears, while 400 miles away and 1 body deep, his older brother sat in a dark that had no light in it at all, and did not know that anything had changed. That is the part 1 keep returning to. Every version of this story is told as the rescue of Zeus, the clever mother, the hidden baby, the stone. It is a good story, and it deserves the attention. But there is a second story running underneath it, and it belongs to a boy who had already been inside the dark for longer than the human race has had cities. He would be pulled out eventually. He would get a crown and a kingdom and a name that people were too nervous to say out loud. He would not get an apology. Nobody in Greek myth ever gets one of those. Being the firstborn son of Cronus was never about being first in line for anything. It was about being first into the dark and finding out you were the only one who could stand it. And in that dark, the god who had counted every single beat of his father's heart since the beginning of his life felt the rhythm change. Just slightly. Just once. Somewhere above him, a stone had gone down where a brother should have been. And a heartbeat is a terrible clock. It never marks the hour. It just keeps going, and you keep counting, and eventually the number stops meaning anything. But he felt the change. One beat landed heavier than the others, the way a footstep sounds different on a stair that has come loose. He had no way to know what it meant. He only knew that something had entered the dark that was not a sister dot. It was not a brother either. It was a rock wrapped in cloth, sitting in the warm nowhere with the 5 of them like an extremely unhelpful houseguest dot. And that was the last new thing that happened for a very long time dot up in the world. The seasons did not exist yet, so nothing marked the years except the Titans getting slightly more comfortable with themselves. Cronus stopped waiting outside doors. He stopped listening for crying. He had a stone in him where his youngest son should have been, and he mistook that heaviness for peace. You have probably done a smaller version of this. You avoid opening one particular envelope, and after a few weeks you genuinely start to feel like the problem inside it has agreed to leave you alone. It has not. It is simply learning to walk. Because on Crete, the youngest god in the universe was growing up in the loudest cave in history. He learned to crawl on wet limestone with bronze shields crashing outside. He learned to stand while grown warriors stamped and hollered in a ring around the cave mouth, hour after hour, purely so his voice would never reach the sky. The goat fed him. The bees brought honey down from the rocks. The nymphs told him stories with the ends taken off, and nobody told him the truth, which is a strange way to raise a liberator. He worked it out anyway. Children always do. You cannot keep a secret in a house where every adult goes quiet at the same moment. The version the Greeks liked best has his mother telling him herself, on a hillside, when he was old enough to hear all of it and young enough to still believe it could be fixed. She told him he had 4 sisters and a brother he had never met. She told him where they were. She told him what she had handed her husband on the night he was born, and then she told him the part that would have broken most people, which is that they were all awake in there, and had been the entire time. He did not shout. That is the detail I like. The god of thunder, the loudest thing in creation, heard the worst news of his life and went completely quiet. Some things are too big to be angry at right away. The anger arrives later, in installments, usually at 3 in the morning. He needed a plan, and he was smart enough to know he was not the one to think of it. So he went to Metis. Metis, the eldest daughter of the ocean, the cleverest being alive in an age when cleverness was still rare and mostly unarmed. She looked at the problem the way an engineer looks at a bridge. Not who is strongest, not who is bravest. Where is the weak joint? And the weak joint was obvious, because it had been the same weak joint for centuries. Cronus never checked. He did not check the swaddling cloth. He did not check the faces of his own children. He would not check a cup. So Metis made something. The Greeks were vague about the recipe, which is probably wise. Some accounts say a drink mixed with mustard and salt. Some say honey and herbs. Every account agrees on what it did, and it is the most undignified moment in the history of the divine. She made the king of the universe an emetic. The whole golden age comes down to a stomach cure. 6 gods, an entire cosmology, and the thing that cracks it open is essentially something you would take after a bad shellfish. Zeus went north disguised as a cupbearer. Young, unremarkable, one more servant in a hall full of servants nobody had ever looked at directly. That is the second joint in the bridge, and it holds true in every era. Powerful people do not see the person holding the jug. He poured wine for the Titans for days. He listened to the same stories his mother had sat through. He watched his father eat. He must have studied that face constantly, the only face he had ever wanted to see and never once seen. Then one morning, at the end of a long night of drinking, he handed the king a cup with something extra in it, and Cronus drank it without looking. What happened next lasted a matter of minutes, and reshaped everything that has happened since. The stone came first. It came up out of him and hit the floor of the hall and rolled, gray and smooth and still wrapped in a piece of cloth that a mother had folded with her own hands. Later, people carried that stone to Delphi and poured oil on it and treated it as sacred, and honestly, they were right to. It is the only rock in Greek myth that ever did anything useful. Then came Poseidon, furious and soaking, and immediately shouting, which is exactly how he had gone in. And then came the fourth child, the first son. Here is the arithmetic that nobody ever says out loud. First in, last but one out. He went into the dark before his brothers existed, and he came out of it after them. Picture the moment from the inside. Because the Greeks never bothered to, and I think they should have. You have known one thing for your entire life: warmth with no shape, sound with no source, a dark so complete that your eyes have never had a reason to work. Then the floor goes out from under a world that had no floor. Everything moves at once, and you land on stone, and stone is a shock all by itself, because you had never touched anything hard before. And there is light, not gentle light, not a dimmer switch, torches, an open flame, and a shaft of morning coming through a doorway, all of it landing on eyes that have been closed since the beginning of time. That is not a rescue. Not in the first second. That is an assault. If you've ever walked out of a matinee into full afternoon sun and stood there swearing, quietly with your hand over your face, you have felt about 1% of it. The Greeks say he was beautiful, dark-haired, tall, silent. They also say, in almost every version, that he did not celebrate. His siblings came out swinging and screaming and demanding names. He came out and stood at the edge of the hall with his back to the wall, and he watched then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia, first in, last out, the eldest daughter arriving in a world that had spent generations, forgetting she was born, 6 gods on the floor of a hall in the mountains, blinking, alive, and roughly the same age as each other, which is not how families normally work, and standing in the middle of them, holding an empty cup, a younger brother they had never met who was somehow already fully grown. That reunion must have been the most awkward room in the history of the universe. 5 siblings who had spent an eternity together in absolute darkness, and one stranger who had spent his whole life in sunlight with a goat and a personal drumline, and who had just saved all of them. They owed him everything. They also did not know him at all. There is a specific flavor of family tension in that, and it never fully went away. It surfaces again in every argument the Olympians ever have, right up to the end of Greek myth. Some families are built on love. Some are built on debt. This one was built on both, and the two of them were never quite the same size. But whatever they felt about each other, they agreed on the immediate item, Their father was still standing there, and the golden age ended the way most golden ages do, not with a fading, but with somebody finally saying out loud what everybody had been not saying at dinner for 400 years. The war that followed lasted 10 years, and the Greeks called it the Titanomachy, Titanomachy. The War of the Titans. 10 years sounds long until you remember that neither side could die. That is the problem with a war between immortals. There is no natural ending. There are only exhaustion and geography. Mountains came apart. The sea stood up in places it should not have. Whole ranges got rearranged, and Greek storytellers spent the next 1,000 years pointing at odd rock formations and saying, that was them. And the truth is, for most of that decade, the younger gods were losing, not badly, just steadily in the way you lose to someone who has more experience than you have hours in the day. The Titans had held the world since the world began. 6 young gods had held it for about 10 minutes. Somewhere in year 8 or 9 of that, the grandmother of everything spoke up again. Gaia, the earth, the one who had started all of this, with a flint blade and a request. Nobody would answer. She told them what her daughter had already learned. You are looking at the wrong problem. Stop asking who is strongest. Ask who is not in the room. And a great many things were not in the room, because Cronus had put them somewhere else. Down under the world. Past the roots of the sea there is a pit, Tartarus. The Greeks measured it with a lovely, terrible image. An anvil dropped from the sky would fall for 9 days before it reached the earth, and then fall 9 more before it reached the bottom of that place. Cronus had prisoners down there. His own brothers, in fact. He had freed them once, when he needed them, and then put them straight back the moment he did not. Which is worth remembering the next time this story tries to tell you he was a good king in a golden age. 3 of them were the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes. Enormous, one-eyed, and the finest metal workers who have ever existed. The other 3 were worse to look at, and far worse to fight. Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones. 50 heads apiece. 100 arms apiece. Rearaos and his 2 brothers sitting in the dark under everything. And here is the sentence I want to leave with you, because Greek myth is full of these and almost nobody catches them. The gods who had just been let out of the dark went down to let somebody else out of the dark. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were the only beings in the universe who did. The Cyclopes came up out of that pit and did the only thing they knew how to do, which was work. They made 3 things. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt. Not a weapon so much as a sentence ending. Every image of him that has survived for 3,000 years has that in his hand. For Poseidon, they made the trident. 3 prongs, and the ability to split stone and open water, and shake the ground under an argument he was losing. And for Hades, they made a helmet, a cap of hide and shadow that did one thing only. It took the wearer out of sight completely, not blurred, not hidden behind something. Gone. The Greeks called it the helm of darkness. And I want you to sit with the joke the universe just made. The brother who spent longer in the dark than anyone alive got handed, as a gift, the power to become the dark. Nobody in that forge said it out loud. Gifts like that never come with a note. The war changed inside a week. The 100-handers picked up boulders in 50 pairs of hands each and threw them in volleys that blacked out the daylight. Zeus threw lightning until the sea boiled at the edges, and the sky held a permanent glow dot, and nobody could find Hades at all dot. That is the thing about the helm. It does not make you strong. It makes you a rumor dot. The story that survived says he walked into his father's own camp, unseen, and took the weapons out of the Titan's hands before a single blow landed. Bronze going missing off a table. A spear that was there a moment ago, an entire army losing a war to something it could not point at. That there is no gore in this part of the story, and I think that is deliberate. The terror of Hades was never violence. It was inevitability with the lights off dot by the end. The Titans had nothing left to swing. The younger gods drove them down into that same pit their prisoners had come out of. Bronze gates went up. A bronze wall went around it, and night poured around the wall 3 times over, the way a scarf wraps a throat, and the 100-handers stayed down there as wardens, which is either poetic justice or the world's worst promotion. Depending on how you look at it, Cronus went into the dark. He had spent his whole reign putting other people into. He did not get an explanation either. Nobody in this family ever does. You could call that revenge. The Greeks mostly did not. They called it the sentence finally arriving, the invoice his own father had written on the night he took the flint, coming due after all that time, exactly as promised. Prophecies in Greece are never threats. They are appointments. And then, quite suddenly, it was over. There is a strange silence at the end of every long war, and this one lasted a while. The lightning stopped. The sea sat back down. The mountains were the wrong shape now. Whole rivers had gone somewhere else. Ash lay on the water for miles and drifted like something soft, and the light came through it the color of weak tea. 6 gods stood in a world that belonged to absolutely no one. The 3 sisters went to see what was left. Hestia found the first hearth and sat down beside it, and the fire came back, and something in the universe unclenched. The brothers stayed on the burnt ground. Zeus, holding the thunderbolt, 20-something years old, and now the most powerful thing in existence. Poseidon, restless, already looking at the water. And Hades, standing slightly apart, with a helmet in his hands and a habit older than both of them, because somebody was going to have to sort out who got what. The sky, the sea, the earth, and everything under it. And the oldest of the 3 brothers, the one who had gone into the dark first and come out nearly last, already knew how these things go for a person like him. The ash kept falling for weeks. After the fighting stopped, it came down soft and gray over the burnt ridges and settled on the water in long streaks that the wind pushed around like something trying to sweep a floor with the wrong tool. The sea had a skin on it. The air tasted faintly of struck flint, and 3 brothers stood in the middle of it, holding weapons that had just ended a war and no longer had anything to point at. That is the worst part of any victory. Everyone imagines the celebrating. Nobody warns you about the silence on the second morning, when the enemy is gone and the mess is still yours. Somebody had to decide who ran what. There is no version of this where they simply shared it. Shared power is a modern idea, and it barely works now. In the age just after the Titans, a thing either had an owner or it had a war. So they sat down. The Greeks are frustratingly quiet about were. I like to imagine a slab of stone still warm from the lightning, because it suits the mood. and because the details we invent are usually the ones that survive. 3 portions were on the table: the sky, which meant weather and thunder, and the high, thin air where nothing could reach you; the sea, which meant every coastline and every ship and every storm that had ever swallowed one; and the underworld, which meant everything below, the dark under the roots, the place all the dead were already going, whether anyone was managing it or not. Notice what is not on that list: the earth itself, the green part, the part with cities and harvests and people in it. That stayed common ground held by all 3, which is a diplomatic way of saying it stayed permanently contested. Every quarrel these 3 ever have for the next 3,000 years happens on that shared middle floor. Families do not fight over the rooms they own. They fight over the kitchen. Now, how the 3 portions got handed out is the single most argued about detail in this entire story, and I want to give you both versions, because which one you believe changes what kind of God Hades is. Version 1 is the lottery. 3 lots, shaken in a helmet. Each brother draws blind. Zeus draws the sky, Poseidon draws the sea, and Hades draws the one nobody wanted. It is beautifully clean. It makes the whole cosmos an accident. It means the god of the dead is not a punishment or a choice. He is a man who lost a coin toss, and then had to live in the result for eternity. I find that version almost unbearably sad, and I think that is exactly why the Greeks kept telling it. Version 2 is the older, less comfortable one, and it comes through in the way certain poets phrase it, that the youngest brother, holding the only weapon that had actually won the war, did the dividing, and that drawing lots was a polite word everyone agreed to use afterward. You have watched that happen. Someone announces that the decision was completely fair while standing in the best room in the house. Nobody argues, because everyone can see the lightning. Here is what makes me lean toward some blend of the 2. Hades did not. Object. Not once. Not in a single surviving line in 1,000 years of Greek storytelling does he demand a recount. Poseidon complained for centuries. He brought it up constantly. He would be halfway through a conversation about something else and managed to mention that he had been given the wet one. Zeus spent his entire reign anxiously defending the sky from anyone who looked at it too long, which is what people do when they suspect they got more than they earned. The eldest brother took the dark and said nothing, and I do not think that was defeat. I think it was recognition. Because think about who was standing there. Of the 3 of them, exactly one had spent the beginning of his life in a place with no light, no exit, and no end. Exactly one had already learned how to keep his mind in one piece, inside a permanent dark. The other 2 would have gone insane down there in a month. Poseidon could not sit still through a conversation. Zeus needed to be looked at. The kingdom of the dead needed a god who could tolerate being unwatched forever. They gave the job to the only one qualified. And then they told a story about a lottery so that nobody had to admit that out loud. So the sky went up, the sea went out, and the eldest turned around and went down. I want to slow this down, because it is the last time in this story that Hades is on the surface with his brothers as an equal, and every retelling rushes past it. Nobody walked him to the door. There was no ceremony, no crown placed on anyone's head, no oath, no feast. The Greeks loved a good divine banquet, and they gave this moment none. Two brothers went to build kingdoms full of noise and worship and temples on hilltops, and one brother walked down a slope into the ground, alone, carrying a helmet that let him disappear, which by then was almost redundant. And here is the thing about the realm. He was walking into Dot. It was not empty, and it was not new. The dead were already there. They had been arriving since the first mortal died, and there had been nobody in charge of any of it. He did not inherit a palace. He inherited a backlog. If you have ever started a job and found out on day one that the position had been vacant for 2 years and nobody had touched the filing, you have the general emotional shape of it. Accept the filing as every human being who has ever died, and it does not stop arriving. The descent itself took a while. The Greeks placed the entrances in real locations, which is one of my favorite things about them. This was not a metaphor to them. It was geography. There was a cave at Cape Tainaron, at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, where the rock goes down into the dark, and the sea sounds strange inside it. Sailors avoided it and knew exactly why. There was a lake called Avernus in Italy, sitting in an old volcanic crater where the water lay perfectly flat and no birds would land on it. Locals said the fumes killed anything that tried, and there were caves in Arcadia where cold air poured out of the ground on hot days, which is the sort of thing that makes a shepherd stop walking and take a different route home. Every culture puts its underworld somewhere specific. The Greeks just happened to write down the addresses. Down he went, past the last root, past the last worm, past the place where stone stops being stone and starts being something older, and the air changed. Not colder, exactly, stiller. The kind of still you get in a room where somebody has just stopped talking. No wind at all, ever, which means no sound of wind, which means the silence has a texture that surface silence never has. The light down there does not come from anywhere. That is the detail the poets kept reaching for, and never quite landed. It is not dark like night. Night has a sky. This is dark like a closed hand, and it went on, and on, larger than the world above it, because it had to be. Every person who ever lives eventually needs a place to stand. He arrived at the edge of a river, and the river was the first real thing. Styx. The Styx, black, slow, and wide, curling around the whole realm 9 times over, like something wrapped around a sleeping animal. The water in it is heavier than water. It does not reflect. It absorbs. And here's the part that tells you what kind of place he had just been handed. Even the gods were afraid of that river. They swore their oaths on it. Not on their father, not on their honor, not on the sky. On the black water underneath everything. And a god who broke an oath sworn on the Styx spent 9 years unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to speak. And then 9 more banished from the table. The most binding force in the entire Greek universe was located in the kingdom nobody wanted. That is a detail worth carrying with you tonight. The Olympians had the temples and the sunlight and the songs, but when they needed something to actually be true, they reached down there. There was already a ferryman, Charon. Old before old was a concept. Unshaven, with eyes like 2 coals that had been left in a fire and then forgotten there. He'd poles a boat across, 1 load at a time, and he has never once been in a hurry. He was not appointed by Hades. He was simply always there, doing the job, the way certain people in every organization predate every manager who has ever been assigned to them. And Karen charged a fare, 1 small coin. That is all. An obol laid under the tongue of the dead by their family before burial. Greek families really did this. Archaeologists pull up skeletons with a coin still sitting in the jaw, 24 centuries later. Somebody's mother pressed that in. Now think about what happens if there is no coin. If you die and nobody finds you. If you drown and the sea keeps you. If your family cannot afford the burial, or does not know, or does not care, you wait. On the near bank. For 100 years, that is the rule, and it is the coldest piece of bureaucracy ever invented by a civilization that loved bureaucracy. The dead were not sorted by whether they were good. They were sorted by whether somebody remembered them, and there were thousands of them standing on that shore when he arrived, reaching, silent mostly. The Greeks said the dead cannot speak properly, only a thin sound, like bats in a cave, or like a leaf being dragged. A whole shoreline of people whose only crime was dying badly or dying poor, badly or dying poor. That was the first thing the new Lord of the Dead saw. Not a throne, a queue. I have wondered for a long time what he did in that first hour. Every temptation of the job was right there. He could have ignored them. He could have walked past that shore to whatever palace was waiting and let the backlog stay a backlog forever. Nobody upstairs was ever going to check. Instead, and this is the thing that quietly defines him for the rest of the story, he started making rules, not laws about morality. He never wrote a single commandment. He did not care what you had believed or who you had prayed to. He made rules about process. Who crosses? In what order? Who decides? Where each kind of soul goes and who is qualified to say so. And I know how that sounds. 3,000 years of horror imagery. And the actual founding act of the God of the Dead was an administrative reform. But look at what the alternative was. A shore with no order on it is not peaceful. It is a crowd. And crowds of the frightened dead, with nobody sorting them, is precisely the nightmare every other culture on earth was busy warning people about. He was building the one thing the universe genuinely needed, and nobody wanted to think about. Meanwhile, upstairs his brothers were doing the opposite. Zeus was building Olympus, which is essentially the world's first exclusive members club, complete with a guest list and a view. Poseidon was collecting coastlines and picking arguments with cities. He would lose one to Athena over an olive tree, and he would be visibly annoyed about it for the rest of recorded myth. They were becoming famous. He was becoming necessary. Those are two completely different careers, and only one of them gets you a festival, because here's what nobody built for the Lord of the Dead. Temples. Almost none. In a country that put a shrine on every hill and named half the calendar after a god, Hades got a handful of sites and a great deal of nervous silence. People did not want to attract his attention. When they sacrificed to him, they turned their faces away. They struck the ground with their hands to make sure he heard, because prayers went up, and he was not up. And they would not say his name, not out of hatred. Out of the same instinct that makes people say passed away instead of died. So they called him other things. The rich one, Pluton, because everything valuable comes out of the ground, the silver. the gold, the grain, the harvest, the hospitable one, which is either a compliment or the most nervous joke a civilization has ever made, the receiver of many, the host of many, every name a workaround. His name meant the unseen one, and they made it so unseen that the name itself went out of use. You can be the most reliable figure in a universe and still be the one people change the subject about. He knew it. He never once complained. And down at the edge of the Black River, with a shoreline of the unburied waiting, and a ferryman who answered to nobody, the eldest son of Cronus started doing the only thing he had ever known how to do. He kept order in the dark because he was the only one who could stand it. Rules need people to enforce them, and he had exactly one employee, and that employee did not report to him. So he started hiring. The first hire was already at the gate, and the gate is where I want to begin, because everyone thinks they know this part, and almost everyone has it slightly wrong. There's a dog.ser-ber-us, Cerberus, 3 heads, a mane of serpents along the neck, a tail that ends in something you would not want to look at closely. Enormous, the size of a wagon, sitting where the path opens out past the river. And here is the correction that changes everything about him. He is not there to keep the living out. He faces inward. His entire job is to stop the dead from leaving. Every mortal who ever came down and expected a monster met a guard dog doing crowd control at an exit. That is a completely different animal. To the newly arrived souls, he was calm, almost welcoming, in the way a dog greets someone coming through the front door. The old poets even say it. He wags for the ones going in. Try to go back out, and you meet the other 3 faces. I love this detail more than almost any other in the underworld, because it is so precisely observed. Anyone who has ever had a dog knows both of those animals live in the same body. He was the child of Typhon and Iduna, which is Greek shorthand for the family that produced every monster worth naming. And of that entire litter, the Hydra, the Chimera, the lot, Cerberus is the only one who got a steady job and kept it for eternity. Everyone else in that family went out and terrorized a region and got killed by a hero in a single afternoon. The dog stayed at the door. There is something almost dignified about it. Then came the judges, and this is where the underworld stops being a place and becomes a system, because a queue at a river is a logistics problem. Deciding where each soul belongs is a moral one, and Hades did something with that decision which I still find remarkable. He gave it away. He did not judge the dead. Not personally, not ever, in any surviving version. The God everyone imagines as the ultimate judge of souls specifically declined the role. He appointed 3 men who had been mortal kings, Men-Os, who had ruled Crete and written the first law codes anyone could remember. Rhadamanthus, his brother, who had a reputation for fairness so unshakable that Greek writers used his name as a synonym for it, and Aeolcus, a king from a small island who had once ended a drought by asking properly. 3 humans. Judging humans. Think about the reasoning there. A god has never been mortal. A god has never been hungry or frightened of the dark or forced to choose badly between 2 bad options at 4 in the morning. How would a god know what a hard life costs? So he handed the moral authority of his entire kingdom to 3 people who had actually lived one. Aeolcus heard the cases from Europe. Rhadamanthus from Asia, and Minos held the final vote when they could not agree. That is a court, a functioning appellate court in the land of the dead. Several centuries before Athens got around to inventing one upstairs, and the god sat above it, and did not interfere. Now, where did the verdict send you? Because the Greek afterlife is not the two-door arrangement people expect, most of the dead went to the asphodel meadows, a gray plain, endless, planted with a pale flower that grows in poor soil and asks for nothing, not painful, not pleasant, simply where everybody went who had been neither monstrous nor magnificent, which is nearly everybody. You wander. You remember, faintly. You are not tormented, and you are not happy. I will be honest with you. This is the part of Greek myth that unsettles me most, and it has nothing to do with monsters. The default outcome for a decent, ordinary, hard-working human life was a field of gray flowers and mild forgetting. The Greeks were not offering comfort. They were describing what they thought was true, which is a much braver thing to build a religion on. Then there was Elysium, warm light. Real light, the only real light down there. Meadows with actual color in them. A soft wind, the only wind in the underworld, which is a detail I find almost unbearably lovely, because everywhere else the air never moves at all. Heroes went there. The exceptional. And later Greek writers, growing gentler over the centuries, opened it up to the merely good, which tells you something about how a culture's imagination softens as its cities get safer. And past that, in the later versions, the Isles of the Blessed, for souls who chose to be reborn 3 times and live well every single time. And then, far down the pit, Tartarus, where the Titans went, where the punished go, and the Greeks were extremely specific about who qualified, not sinners in general, not people who broke a rule. The pit was reserved for a very short list of crimes, and they are all the same crime wearing different clothes. Tantalus fed his own son to the gods at a dinner table to see if they would notice. He stands forever in water that drains when he bends, under fruit that lifts when he reaches. Sisyphus cheated death twice and chained the god sent to collect him. He pushes the stone. Ixion was invited to the table of the gods and repaid the hospitality by making a move on the host's wife. Look at what connects them. Every single one was shown extraordinary trust and abused it. That is the crime the Greeks considered unforgivable. Not violence, not even murder. Betrayal of a host or a guest or a table you were welcomed at. They called it xenia, guest friendship, the most sacred obligation in Greek life, and the god enforcing the punishment for breaking it carried, as one of his own titles, the hospitable one. That is not a coincidence. That is a civilization telling you what it valued. In the darkest room it had. Then there are the rivers, and there are 5 of them, and each one was named for a feeling. The Styx is hatred. The Oath River, the black boundary. Acheron is the river of pain, and in some tellings it is Acheron the ferryman crosses, not the Styx. The Greeks were inconsistent about this, and I have decided to find that charming rather than annoying. Cock-u-tus is wailing. The unburied gathered there, the ones with no coin, and the sound off that water is the only sound in the underworld that never stops. Flegethon burns, a river of fire that runs down toward the pit and never consumes what it touches, and Lethe is forgetting. Drink from it and everything goes. your name, your mother's face. The specific way the light came into a room you loved. Some souls drank because they were about to be reborn and could not carry the old life into the new one. Some drank simply because remembering was worse. 5 rivers, and every one of them is an emotion with a current. Hatred, pain, grief, rage, and forgetting. That is not a map of a place. That is a map of what happens inside a person after somebody dies. And the Greeks drew it as geography because it was too big to say directly, and the god of it all lived in a palace, somewhere past the meadows, and almost nobody has ever described it. That is genuinely strange. Greek poetry inventories everything. Olympus gets described down to the door hinges. Poseidon's halls glitter for whole paragraphs. Hades gets a sentence, maybe 2. Dark, vast, quiet. Nobody who went inside came back to tell the decorators what they had seen. Or they went, and they did not want to talk about it after . So he sat in a hall nobody could picture, in a kingdom the size of the world, doing a job with no holidays, no visitors, no festivals, and no end. And here is the loneliness nobody names when they talk about this god. His brothers had company constantly. Zeus had a hall full of Olympians and a hobby that produced an inexhaustible supply of new relatives. Poseidon had nymphs and rivers and half the sea talking back at him. Hades had subjects who could not speak above a whisper, and had all arrived on the worst day of their lives. Nobody down there was ever glad to see him. That is the part that gets me. Every single person he met was definitionally having the worst possible experience. Imagine spending eternity in a room where everyone present would leave immediately if they could, and you are the reason they cannot. You would get quiet. You would get very, very quiet. There is a moment when a new job stops being new, and you look up and realize the arrangement is now simply your life. For most people, that takes about 18 months. For him, it took a few hundred years, and then it kept going. He did the work. He kept the boundary, and whatever the surface world believed about him, the underworld ran, which is more than could be said for the sky, where his youngest brother was already generating problems that would take 3,000 years of poetry to catalog. But something had started. Down in that quiet, the palace stayed empty on one side. There was a throne, and beside it, in every description that survives, there was a second throne, empty, waiting. Nobody has ever explained who built it, or why it was there before anyone sat in it. And far above, in a field in Sicily with real sun on it, a girl was picking flowers with her friends and complaining about her mother. Every mortal who ever tried to describe the underworld started at the same place, and it was never the gate, it was the moment the air changes. You feel it before you see anything. The Greeks who lived near the cave mouths knew it well. You walk down a slope you have walked 100 times, and at a certain point the air stops moving against your skin. No breeze, no draft, nothing. The temperature does not drop much. That surprises people. It is not a freezer. It is a held breath, and sound behaves incorrectly. Your own footsteps arrive a fraction late and come back thinner than they left, like something copied badly. Speak, and the words do not carry. They fall. If you have ever walked into a room where thick snow has just fallen outside and everything has gone strangely padded and wrong, you have met a cousin of that feeling. Except there is no snow, and no outside. That is the border, not a door. A change in how the world behaves below it. The descent goes on far longer than any cave should. The Greeks were clear about that. This is not a cavern. Caverns end. The walls stop being limestone and start being something older with no name. And eventually there are no walls at all. Only the sense that there is a great deal of weight above you and it does not care. And then the ground levels out and you are on the shore. Let me put you there properly, because this is the single most described landscape in ancient literature and it deserves the time. The bank underfoot is not sand and it is not mud. It is a fine gray grit that takes a footprint and holds it, and there are footprints everywhere, thousands, all pointing the same direction, none of them coming back. The river ahead of you is wide enough that the far side is a suggestion rather than a fact. The water does not sparkle. That is the detail every poet reached for. Water is supposed to catch light and throw it around. This water takes light in and returns nothing, so it reads as a long black absence lying across the world. It moves slowly. There is a sound, but it is not a river sound. It is lower, and it is underneath everything. And after a while, you stop noticing it. And then you notice you stopped noticing it, and that is worse. The Styx wraps this whole kingdom 9 times. 9 coils of black water between the dead and any way back. Not one boundary. 9. Somebody wanted this closed, and the shore is crowded. Here is where the underworld first tells you what kind of place it is. The dead on that bank are not being tortured. Nobody is screaming. They are waiting, and they have been waiting for years, and they will wait for 100. These are the unburied, the ones with no coin, sailors the sea kept, soldiers left on a field where the winning side had other priorities, the poor whose families could not afford the rights, travelers who died a long way from anyone who knew their face. They drift at the edge of the water, and they reach out and they make that thin sound Greeks compared to bats, a dry rustle. High and small, the noise a leaf makes when it is dragged across stone. The dead cannot speak properly down here. That is a rule. Whatever it is that makes a voice stays with the body, and it is worth stopping on how deeply that shaped the living world above. Greek families did not bury their dead out of sentiment alone. They did it because they believed sincerely that leaving a body unburied left a person standing on a gray shore for a century. There are Greek plays built entirely on this. A sister risking execution to throw 3 handfuls of dust on her brother's body, because 3 handfuls were enough. That is the whole plot, and Athenian audiences did not need it explained. An enemy's corpse got returned after a battle. A drowned stranger washed up on your beach got covered. You did not have to have liked them. The kindest law in Greek life came directly out of the most frightening idea in Greek religion. That happens more often than you would think. Then the boat comes. You hear the pull before you see anything. A wet knock and a long draw and a pause. Then again. Charon does not call out. He does not announce himself. He simply arrives, and he is old in a way that has nothing to do with years. Old like a thing that was made old and has stayed. Exactly that old ever since. Gray beard. Filthy cloak knotted at one shoulder. Arms like rope. and the eyes which the Roman poets described as points of steady fire, unblinking, entirely without interest in you personally. He looks at your mouth first, always the mouth, and here's the transaction that a whole civilization organized its funerals around. One coin under the tongue, dot and obel. Low value. A day's bread, roughly. Not a fortune, and that is exactly the point. It was never about the money, Dot. It was proof that somebody had stood over your body and thought about you and done the thing properly. The coin is not a fare. It is evidence that you were loved or at least attended to. Dot. No coin, no crossing. He does not argue about it. He simply does not see you, and if you are alive, if you are one of the very few who came down here with a heartbeat still in you, he will not take you either. And he gets loud about it. The boat sits low with the weight of the living. Karen complained about that every single time it happened, and every version, which is my favorite recurring joke in Greek myth. The ferryman of the dead, an immortal servant of the Lord of the underworld, chiefly annoyed about the loading capacity of his boat. The crossing itself is not long. The poets never dwell on it. You sit. Nobody speaks. The pole knocks and draws, and the whole time the light behind you, whatever thin light there was, gets a little further away, and the thing ahead of you does not get any brighter to compensate. Then the boat touches the far bank and everybody gets off, and there is no ceremony to that either. Now the path narrows, and the ground rises slightly, and ahead of you is the gate, not a wall with a door in it. The Greeks were vague about what the gate is made of, and specific about what stands in front of it. You hear him breathing first. 3 sets of lungs out of time with each other, which is a sound no living creature makes, and your body knows it immediately. Cerberus is bigger than the descriptions let you assume. Shoulder height on a grown man, wide as a doorway, lying with his 4 legs out and 3 heads at different angles like a dog, half asleep in a warm hall. The mane along his neck moves on its own. Snakes, thin and dark, shifting slowly the way water shifts. And when the new dead come up the path from the boat, he lifts one head and he watches them go by. And the tail, the terrible tail, moves. He is pleased to see them. That is not a joke. The oldest account we have says exactly that. He fawns on those who enter. They file past a monster that is glad they came. And they walk through, and not one of them understands yet what that means. It means the direction of the danger is the other way, I want to be clear about how well designed this is, because whoever built this system thought about it properly. Every prison in human history has faced the same problem. Guards at the entrance stop invasions. Guards at the exit stop escapes. And any warden will tell you which of those 2 jobs actually keeps the place running. The underworld barely had an entry problem. Almost nobody wants in. The entire pressure on that gate, every hour of eternity, comes from inside, from the dead who have realized what has happened to them and would like very much to go home. So, the guard faces inward, and he is enormous, and he never sleeps, because he has 3 sets of eyes, and they take turns, and now you are inside, and the kingdom opens up. The first thing that gets you is the scale. This is not a cave system. It is a country, larger than Greece, larger than the world above, because it has to be. Every person who ever lived is in here somewhere, and the arrivals never stop. The ceiling, if there is one, is not visible. There is no sky, but there is not exactly a roof either. There is a dark overhead that reads as distance rather than surface. And the light. This is the thing nobody gets right in the paintings. There is light down here, and it does not come from anywhere. No sun, no moon, no torches on the walls, no fire. But you can see, dimly, evenly, from all directions at once, the way a room looks on a heavily overcast morning about an hour before proper dawn. That is the strangest sensory fact about the whole realm, and the Greeks stated it plainly. Objects have no strong shadows down here, because shadow requires a source. Everything is lit, and nothing is illuminated. There is a difference, and your eyes hate it. Ahead of the gate, the path splits, and this is the fork the whole system runs on. To one side. A road goes off toward a plain so wide it has no visible end. That is asphodel, and it is where nearly all of you are going. And I will tell you about it in a moment, because it deserves more care than it usually gets. To the other side, the ground drops. Not a slope, a drop. That is where the pit is, and the road going down there is not one anybody walks voluntarily. And straight ahead, past the meadow's edge, there is a building. You cannot see it well from the gate. That may be deliberate. It sits far out on the gray plain, the way a mountain sits on a horizon. You register it as a shape and a weight rather than as architecture. Dark stone, enormous. No lights in it. Greek poets who happily spent 40 lines on the hinges of Olympus give that palace one adjective and move on. I have thought about why for a long time, and I think the answer is simple and slightly chilling. To describe the inside of a house, somebody has to have been inside it and come back out. Almost nobody had. The dead who go in are not returning to file a report. The 3 or 4 living men who managed it came back changed, and in every single case notably reluctant to discuss the details. So, the most famous building in the Greek imagination has no floor plan. And on the plain in front of it, the dead arrive and arrive and arrive in a queue that started before Greece existed and has never once been shorter than it was the day before. Somebody has to sort them. Sorting is not a ceremony. It is closer to a shift change, and shift changes do not stop for anyone, which is the first quiet lesson every new arrival learns on that plane. Usually within the hour, the 3 judges hear each case, weigh it, and send the shade walking, and none of it takes very long. Most lives laid flat and looked at from the outside are not complicated. A person worked. A person loved somebody, badly or well. A person made a handful of choices that mattered and a great many more that never did. So the shade walks on, out past the gate, into the gray, and this is usually where a story like this one stops paying attention, because asphodel gets treated as background. A field you pass through on the way to somewhere more interesting. It is not background. It is where almost everyone who has ever lived is standing right now, including, statistically, someone you once loved. The flowers there are small and the color of old bone, and they grow in soil that would grow nothing else thin. Ashy ground a living farmer would take one look at and walk straight past. That is the whole point of the flower. It asks for nothing, because nothing is what the meadow has to give. The light sits flat and gray with no particular source, and underfoot the ground is a fine dry grit that barely holds a footprint, because a shade barely has weight enough to leave one, and the shades themselves drift rather than walk. Not lost, exactly, just unhurried in a way nothing living ever gets to be. Stand there long enough and you start noticing who is who, or rather, who used to be who. A man who was a soldier stands a few paces from a woman who spent her whole life threshing grain on a hillside, and neither one carries any mark of what they were. No rank, no calluses, no crown on the rare shade who had worn one. That was the only truly fair thing that ever happened to any of them. They pass each other, sometimes. Occasionally two shades slow down, as if a name is trying to surface, a face that used to matter enormously. It doesn't quite arrive. They drift on, and neither seems especially troubled, which might be the saddest detail in the whole religion, or the kindest one, depending on the morning you ask it. If you have ever surfaced from a dream, so vivid at 4 in the morning that you were certain you would remember it forever, and then lost the whole shape of it by the time the coffee finished, you already know the texture of what happens on that plane, except nothing here ever gets made up for later. No version of the day brings it back. There is no morning to start a routine down here, and no evening to end one. And yet the God who ran the place kept one anyway, because habits do not actually need a clock. They only need repetition. He walked the edge of asphodel some hours alone, watching the shades drift the way a farmer walks a field he already knows every inch of. Most of them never once realized their king had passed within arm's reach. If anyone had asked him, that was exactly how he preferred it. He checked the gate some nights, if night still means anything in a place with no sun to take it away. Not because Cerberus needed checking, because the checking was his, and a kingdom this size runs on someone doing the small, unnecessary things anyway. He walked the near bank sometimes too, where the unburied still waited, and he did not free a single one of them early, and he did not pretend that didn't cost him something. Rules that bend for the person enforcing them stop being rules. He understood that better than anyone who has ever held power. A good day, for him, meant no complaints from the ferryman about the boat. No fury dragging old blood across the meadow floor, and no new argument to referee between judges who had been quietly disagreeing with each other for 300 years. It was not a glamorous bar to clear. He cleared it anyway. Every day there was no day. Two gods lived at the very edge of this kingdom that the newly arrived almost never noticed passing, and one of them, up in the daylight, mortals prayed to every single night of their lives without exception. Twins, sons of Night herself, Nyx, the oldest and least sociable of the primal powers, a goddess so far up the family tree that even Zeus, by every surviving account, preferred not to go looking for her. Their house sat at the far western threshold, where the last daylight met the first breath of this place, and the two of them shared that roof the way brothers who could not be more different somehow always end up sharing 1.hip-NOS, sleep. Gentle, welcomed everywhere, invoked in half the households of Greece before anyone dared close their eyes. He held a kind of power nobody else in the family could claim. Even the king of the sky went under at his touch. And more than once, usually on nights, his wife had arranged exactly that, needing her husband occupied elsewhere while she got something done, beside him doing what was, strictly speaking, an extremely similar job. Then a two's death. The twin nobody ever wrote a lullaby for. The old poets were harsh about him, iron-hearted. They called him hated even among the gods. But go looking at the pottery instead of the poetry, and a gentler picture turns up. The two brothers together, wings spread, lifting a fallen soldier off a battlefield with the same careful hands, carrying him home to be buried properly among his own people. Two brothers, doing what amounts to the same shift at opposite ends of a single night, and one of them gets a hymn sung in every household, while the other gets left off the guest list for eternity. Watch any workplace long enough, and you will find this exact arrangement. One person doing the visible half of a job, the other doing the harder half quietly, and only one name ever makes it onto the card. Nobody has ever built Hypnos a temple people were nervous to enter. Down at the threshold, though, the two of them lived together without complaint, because they understood something about each other that the daylight world never once bothered learning. Not every guilty shade waited its turn in that queue. Some crimes moved faster than any court could, and for those, the kingdom kept something considerably older than its judges, the same blood that once put a flint blade into a mother's hand. Generations before this family had names worth remembering, did not simply disappear into the ground where it fell. It became something. Three sisters, old before the Titans were old, older than the calm system Hades had built around them, answering in any real sense to nobody at all, not fully even to him. They came for a very specific kind of guilt. Not theft, not even ordinary murder most of the time. They hunted the crimes that broke the one bond a family is supposed to guarantee. A child who raised a hand against a parent, an oath sworn and then shattered, blood spilled on blood that should have protected it. You did not see them coming. You heard something first, a sound like weather that has not decided yet whether it will break. Then a smell arrived, faint and metallic, like the air before a storm that never quite lands. Dark wings the color of old bronze. Hair that moved on its own, the way the mane at the gate moved. Except nobody down here found this version welcoming. They did not stop, and they did not negotiate. And no bribe worked on them twice. Here is the meaning decode worth sitting with. They were never really monsters. They were what a guilty conscience feels like from the outside, given wings and a schedule to keep. Hades let them operate on their own authority. He did not command them, and he did not particularly try to. Some parts of justice, even a god learns, are older than any office ever built to house them, and the wiser rulers leave those parts exactly where they already are. One more figure moved through this kingdom more freely than anyone else in it, walking the seam between the world above and the one below as easily as stepping over a threshold in her own house. Hecate, torches in both hands, always the only light down here that came from somewhere. Mortals left her supper at crossroads on the darkest nights of the month and walked away without looking back, because looking back was supposed to undo the offering. Bread, a fish, sometimes. Whatever a household could spare for a goddess, who fed the wandering dead as much as she fed herself. She guided the restless shades who walked above ground, on the wrong nights, back down to where they belonged. She passed through gates that stayed shut for absolutely everyone else, including most of the other gods, and more than once, in that dark palace where a second throne had sat empty since the day it was built, the few who paid attention noticed her nearby, tending a chair no one had ever sat in, straightening what did not need straightening, as if she already knew something the rest of the kingdom had not been told yet. Nobody asked her to explain it. You did not generally ask Hecate to explain herself. By now the kingdom had every piece it would ever need. A river marked with an oath even gods were afraid to break. A dog who loved you on the way in. A ferryman who complained about his boat, and had complained about it for centuries, and would keep complaining for centuries more. 3 mortal kings turned judges. A meadow wide enough to hold everyone who had ever tried and failed to become somebody extraordinary. A pit deep enough to hold the handful who abused a trust nobody should ever abuse. Twin gods keeping the threshold, one beloved and one blamed for doing half of the same work. 3 sisters older than the whole arrangement, enforcing the one law that mattered before any of the others were written down. Upstairs, his brothers were still redrawing coastlines and starting arguments over cattle and calling it governance. Down here, everything simply ran. Nobody had ever once called that a triumph. He had built the only government in the entire universe that never broke down, never revolted, and never needed a single war to keep functioning. And he had built it alone in the dark, with no one watching and no one keeping score. He had stopped waiting for anyone to notice a long time ago. 9 girls moved through the tall grass together, laughing at something only they had heard. And Persephone was the only one among them who was not, strictly speaking, supposed to wander far. Per-sef O-nay. Persephone, Demeter's only daughter, and by every account the single, most watched over young goddess in the whole of creation. Her mother had chosen this meadow herself, chosen the friends too, mostly, a cluster of ocean's daughters, gentle and biddable, the kind of company a careful parent picks specifically because nothing interesting ever happens around them. Demeter checked on her constantly, not out of cruelty, out of the particular fear that comes from having lost 4 sisters into the dark before you ever grew your first stalk of wheat, and deciding quietly that it would never happen to anyone you loved again. You know this kind of mother, the one who wants to know exactly which field, with exactly which friends, home by exactly what hour. It rarely reads as love in the moment. It only reads as love from a distance, usually a great deal later. The meadow itself sat near a green rise the locals would one day call Enna, close enough to the coast that on a clear morning the sea showed as a hard blue line at the edge of everything. Wildflowers grew there in the ordinary chaos flowers grow in, poppies leaning one way, asphodel another, the whole field breathing out that particular warm grass smell that never quite survives being written down. The other girls picked idly. Electra found a patch of violets and declared them superior to every other violet in creation. Ianthe was making a crown out of something that would wilt within the hour, and not admitting it. Persephone drifted a little apart from them, the way you do when you're the only one in the group who has never once been allowed to drift, down below all of it, in a hall nobody had ever properly described. There was still a second throne with nobody sitting in it. He had stopped mentioning it. That was new. For longer than anyone had been counting, he simply hadn't brought it up at all. Not to Hecate, not to the judges, not even particularly to himself. A god can go a very long time pretending a piece of furniture is just furniture, but he had eyes everywhere in that kingdom, which is a strange kind of power to hold when the one thing you actually want is nowhere inside your own borders. Everyone he'd governed had already lived their whole story. He wanted for once to be standing at the beginning of somebody's dot, so he did the only thing available to a god with no charm offensive in his repertoire and absolutely no patience for one. He went upstairs and asked his brother directly, not Persephone. Zeus. This was technically correct procedure. A father's blessing, formally requested. One Olympian to another, Hades laid it out plainly, the way he laid out everything, with no embellishment and no performance. He wanted her. He asked permission to take her as his wife, and Zeus, who was extremely good at solving problems that belonged to other people, said yes almost immediately. He did not mention it to Demeter. That detail is the whole hinge of this story, and it deserves a moment before we move past it. He simply agreed, quietly, the way a decision sometimes gets made in a room you were never invited into, and you only find out about it once everyone else is already acting on it. He told himself it would sort itself out later. Fathers in this family have a long, unimpressive tradition of believing that so the arrangement needed one more piece, and Zeus asked his own grandmother for it. Gaia, the earth herself, who had been quietly stage managing this entire family since the night she handed Cronus a flint blade, agreed to grow something that had never existed before, a flower. Not an ordinary one. It came up from 100 separate roots at once, a single bloom with 100 faces, and it smelled sweet enough that the sky itself was said to lean in a little, and the sea, some distance off, went briefly, oddly still. It was the kind of flower that if it turned up today as a photograph in your feed, you'd assume had been edited too perfect, too symmetrical. Obviously built to be looked at. It grew a short distance from where the girls were playing, close enough to notice, far enough to require a choice. Persephone saw it before any of the others did. She has been called curious in every version of this story that survives, and I don't think that's an insult, whatever it cost her. Curiosity is simply what happens to somebody who has spent her entire life inside a fence, the moment she sees something growing just outside it. Everyone here has done a smaller version of this, wandered off from the group at a market or a festival, chasing one bright thing across a crowded square, telling yourself you'd only be a moment. Most of the time, the story ends with you finding your friends again, mildly annoyed. Nothing lost but a few minutes. She reached down to pick it, and the ground did not so much open as arrive somewhere else entirely. The grass simply stopped being solid, and a dark scene split wide beneath her, and the warm smell of crushed flowers was suddenly mixed with something colder, older, coming up from underneath the whole world. 2 black horses came through first, and then the chariot, and then him, not disguised, not gentle about it. A god arriving the only way he had ever known how to arrive anywhere, which was completely and all at once. I won't dress this up as anything softer than it was. He took her by the wrist, and the chariot turned. and the earth that had opened for him closed again behind them within a handful of seconds. As if Gaia herself couldn't stand to watch any longer than that dot, the flowers she'd been holding scattered across the grass and stayed there. Nobody picked them back up for a very long time. She screamed once, high and short, and it went further than any sound in that meadow had any right to go dot far off and far up. A chariot of an entirely different kind was crossing open sky, and its driver missed nothing that happened on the earth below him, ever, because seeing everything was simply the job. Helios said nothing, not yet. Watching was the job. Telling was somebody else's later, and deep in a cave that smelled permanently of torch smoke and wet stone, something that had been sitting very still for a very long time lifted its head, as if a thread it had been quietly holding for years had just finally been pulled taut dot up in the meadow. 7 girls were still laughing about violets, still not looking up. Somewhere across that same field, a mother had just called her daughter's name for the second time, expecting the same answer she had gotten every single time before this one, and for the first time in Persephone's entire life, nothing answered back. Demeter called a 3rd time, and then a 4th, and somewhere around the 5th her voice stopped sounding like a mother looking for a daughter who had simply wandered off dot. She reached the spot in the grass within minutes. The other girls were still there, dazed, some of them crying without entirely knowing why. The flowers Persephone had been reaching for lay scattered across broken ground, already wilting, no blood. No struggle marks beyond the flattened grass, just an absence, precise and total, the kind that a parent's whole body recognizes before the mind has caught up enough to name it, and a silence over that field so complete it seemed to have its own weight. She did not sleep that night. She did not sleep for the next 9. The old telling is specific about this, and the specificity is the whole point. Demeter lit 2 torches from the fire on Mount Etna and walked. She did not eat. She did not wash. She did not sit down to rest in any hall, any temple, any bed that belonged to her. If you have ever spent a night unable to do anything but replay one terrible hour on a loop, checking your phone every few minutes for a message that refuses to arrive, you already understand roughly 1% of those 9 days. She had the whole earth to search, and nothing in it was answering dot on the 10th day. At a crossroads where 3 roads met, she found someone waiting. Hecate, torches in both hands, exactly as she always carried them, exactly as we met her once, keeping watch near a certain empty throne. She had heard the cry, too. Everyone in 3 worlds seemed to have heard it, except the one god who might have stopped it, but hearing is not seeing. Hecate had been indoors. She knew a scream had happened. She did not know whose hands had caused it dot. There was only one witness who saw everything that happened on the earth, every single day, without exception. He-Li-Os, Helios, the sun. He crosses the whole sky in his chariot from one edge of the world to the other, and there is nowhere his light does not eventually reach, which means there is nothing he does not eventually see. The 2 goddesses found him at the end of his day's run, and Demeter did not soften the question. She wanted a name. Helios, who seemed to find the entire situation less alarming than everyone else did, told her plainly. Hades had taken her daughter. With the sky's own blessing, Zeus had agreed to the marriage days before, and had simply never mentioned it to anyone who might have said no. He even offered, in that maddeningly reasonable tone gods use when they think they are being helpful, that it was hardly such a poor match. A great god, a great kingdom. Nothing to grieve over, really. You know this exact conversation, even if you have never once spoken to a sun god. It is the friend who tells you to calm down 2 sentences after telling you the actual news. It rarely lands the way they intend. Demeter did not go home to Olympus. Something in her had moved past the kind of anger that shouts into the kind that goes quiet and starts making decisions instead. She took off whatever it is that makes a goddess look like a goddess. The light, the height, the certainty in the shoulders, and walked the earth disguised as an old woman. Gray, unremarkable, the sort of stranger nobody looks at twice. She came, eventually, to a town called Eleusis. She sat by a well in the shade, tired in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. The daughters of the local king found her there, and being kind in the ordinary human way that costs nothing and means everything, brought her home. Their father, Kel-Eus, and his wife, Metanira, had a new son, small and often unwell, and the household needed a nurse. Nobody in that house had the faintest idea who had just walked through their door. She was gentle with the boy, DEM-O-FON, in every way a household could see. What they could not see is what she did after the fire was banked down each night. Once the house had gone quiet and everyone else was asleep, she held him in the embers, glowing but untouched by any actual flame, the way only a god's fire works, not to hurt him. The opposite. She was trying to burn the mortality out of him, the way you might slowly work a splinter to the surface, meaning to hand his parents back a son who could never die. Grief does strange, enormous things with the tools it has on hand, and a goddess grieving her own stolen child had tools no mortal parent ever gets. It might have worked. We will never know. Metanira woke one night and went looking for her son. She found him lying in the low coals, glowing faintly but unburned, with an old woman standing calmly over him. She screamed the scream any mother would have screamed, and she was, of course, completely right, too. That scream broke something Demeter had been holding together by force of will alone. She set the child down. She straightened, and the disguise came off her the way morning comes off a hillside. Not slowly, all at once, and the small, dim room filled with a light that had nowhere near enough space to hold it. She was not the frightening kind of god in that moment. She was the tired kind, the kind that has simply stopped pretending, and somehow that was worse to look at. She told them plainly what had almost happened, and what would now never happen. None of it came with any particular kindness. Kindness was not what she had left in her that week. Then she told them what she wanted instead. A temple, here on this ground, the largest they could build, and an altar beside it where she would personally teach the people of this town a set of rites that no outsider would ever fully explain again. For as long as Greece existed, they built it. Of course they built it. Nobody negotiates with a goddess standing in their nursery, glowing like a struck match. That temple became one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. People traveled from every corner of Greece for centuries afterward, hoping to be initiated into whatever happened inside it. Every single one of them kept the secret. In a culture that gossiped about absolutely everything else, that is its own kind of miracle. But that came later. Right then, the temple finished, Demeter went inside it, sat down, and did not get up. And the earth noticed. She had never commanded the crops to fail. Nobody ever accused her of that. Exactly. It was simpler and colder than a command. She was the reason anything grew at all, and a goddess who has stopped participating in the world cannot very well keep making that world green. So, the wheat did not come up. The olive trees held their fruit half-formed and let it drop, hard and useless, into dry dirt. Herds went thin. Wills that had run for generations kept running, but there was nothing left worth watering. A year like that does not stay contained to one field or one country. It becomes the only story anyone above ground is telling in every language. At the same time, and it reached the one place that could not afford to ignore it, because gods eat smoke. That is the blunt truth underneath every altar in Greece. The smell of a good sacrifice rising off a fire is, in a real sense, dinner. A starving humanity cannot spare a single lamb for anybody's altar. Ask a family that hasn't eaten in a week to set aside their last goat for Olympus, and see how that conversation goes. Zeus, who could ignore almost anything for almost any length of time, could not ignore an empty table. He sent messengers one after another, the way you might send text after text to someone who has simply stopped answering. Each one came back with the same report. She would not leave that temple. She would not so much as glance at a green stalk again, not for any god, not for any price, until her daughter stood in front of her. So Zeus finally did the one thing that was always going to work. He stopped negotiating with the wrong sibling. He sent Hermes down to the underworld itself, with an order that even the god of the dead was not going to argue with. Bring her back. Down in that quiet palace. The request landed the way most things landed on Hades, without a raised voice, and without a single word of protest. He had never once fought his brothers for anything. Not the throne, not the lottery, not this. Whatever else you want to say about him, he never built his kingdom on stolen ground, and he was not about to start refusing to hand back what was never rightfully his in the first place. But he had spent months, some tellings say longer, with a second presence in that enormous silent house. And I don't think it's overstating things to say the quiet had changed shape around her. He had shown her the kingdom, unhurried, the way you might finally show someone the whole of a house you've lived alone in for a very long time. The judges, the long gray stretch of asphodel, the dog who wagged for everyone coming in and let nobody go the other way. She had not spoken much in most of the old accounts. She had not eaten either, not for a long while. Any culture that took hospitality as seriously as the Greeks did would have recognized that instantly, as a message all on its own. Whether something else had shifted underneath all of that silence, the old poets never quite agree, and I am not going to pretend they settled it. Some tellings leave her simply grieving the whole time. Others leave the door open to something more complicated. The myth keeps both possibilities and asks you to sit with them, which is more honest than picking one. What we do know is what happened the moment before she climbed into Hermes' chariot to go home. Hades offered her a pomegranate, or she took one herself, The old hymn is careful and a little slippery about which one it was. Careful in a way that feels deliberate. The way a story gets vague exactly where the truth would be uncomfortable either way. She ate a small number of the seeds. The count changes teller to teller. A handful, a few, sometimes just one, but the shape of the rule never changes at all. Anyone who eats the food of the dead belongs, in part, to the dead. That was never a curse invented for her. It was simply how that kingdom worked. The same iron rule that had governed the ferryman's coin and the oath on the Black River since before she was born. She rose up into daylight, so bright it must have hurt. She went straight into her mother's arms, and for one entire, complete moment, neither of them thought about anything except each other. Flowers came up around them where they stood. Not planted, not grown. Simply there, the way they always were. When Demeter's grief finally let go of a place, then Demeter asked the question every mother in this story eventually has to ask. Did you eat anything down there? And Persephone told her the compromise that followed did not come from Hades. It did not come from Demeter either. Both of them had already proven in their different ways that they could hold a position forever. It came from higher up, brokered between Zeus and his own mother. Old Rhea, who had once smuggled a stone into a hall wrapped in swaddling cloth, knew a thing or two about managing this exact family. For part of every year, Persephone returns below. And for the rest of it, she comes back up, and the earth, without anyone giving it an order, remembers how to be green. That is the whole architecture of a season, built out of one mother's grief and one God's quiet insistence on the rules of his own house. Every winter since has been Demeter waiting by that temple door. Every spring has been the door opening. There is a version of this that gets told as pure tragedy, and there is a version that gets told as the beginning of something neither God ever expected. I will tell you honestly that the ancient sources do not agree, and I think that disagreement is the most human part of the entire myth. Grief and change are rarely as clean as one word can hold. What is certain is this: the second throne in that dark palace, empty since the day it was carved, has not been empty since in the oldest prayers and the oldest curses alike. People never reduced Persephone to a footnote in her mother's harvest. The Greeks invoked her in her own right, by her own name, as queen of everything below the ground, feared and petitioned for mercy in the same breath as her husband, somewhere above. A temple at Eleusis kept its secret for 2,000 years. It promised everyone who walked through its doors a gentler road through the one country. Every single listener tonight will eventually visit. Somewhere below, in a hall with no window and no clock, a god sat who had ruled the dead completely alone for longer than most of Greece could remember. Someone sat beside him now. Neither of them was in any hurry to explain what that meant. Some things even gods leave sitting quietly for a while before they decide what to call them. The wedding lasted exactly one afternoon. Orpheus married Eurydice in a meadow somewhere in Thrace, garlands still fresh on the tables, his lyre propped against a tree, because even at his own wedding somebody kept asking him to play just one more song. He came from strange parentage, even by the standards of this family. His mother was Calliope, one of the 9 muses, the one who governs epic poetry, which meant her son had been raised, quite literally, inside the art of telling a story well. His father was said to be a river or a king, depending on which town you asked, and nobody in Thrace ever bothered settling the argument, because it hardly mattered next to what the boy could do with a lyre. He was, by every surviving account, the finest musician who had ever lived. Not merely skilled, the kind of gifted where rivers were said to slow down and listen, where stones softened at the edges, where wild animals laid down in a loose circle around him and forgot, for as long as the song lasted, which of them was predator and which was prey. Eurydice was a nymph of the same woods he had grown up wandering, quick and quietly funny in the accounts that bother mentioning her personality at all, which is fewer than she deserved. Most of what survives about her comes from the shape of what was taken, rather than from her own voice, and that in itself tells you something about which half of every love story usually gets written down. She ran from something in the grass that afternoon. The old sources disagree on exactly what. A satyr in some tellings, simple bad luck in others, and a snake did the rest before anyone reached her in time. It was fast. It was quiet. It was over before the music even finished playing somewhere else in the same meadow, which meant Orpheus did not even know for several long minutes that the day had already broken in half. Grief, for most people, arrives first as noise, and only later goes quiet. His went the other way. He did not wail. He did not tear anything. He sat with the lyre across his knees for 3 full days, and did not touch a string, which for a man who had never once in his life gone silent for 3 hours, let alone 3 days, frightened everyone who loved him considerably more than tears would have. Then, on the 4th morning, he stood up, picked up the lyre, and walked toward the one door in the world that most people spend their entire lives trying very hard not to think about. He knew exactly where it was. Everyone did by then. A cave mouth at Tanneron, at the southern tip of the mainland, where the rock drops away into the dark and the sea makes a sound against the stone that no sailor in that region has ever fully gotten used to. If you have ever been asked to accept a loss you had absolutely no intention of accepting, some verdict from a doctor, some ending you were not consulted on, you already understand the walk down that slope better than any description could manage for you. The descent took him past the last real light, and into that stiller, older air the dead all eventually learn to breathe. No wind down there, which means no sound of wind, which means every footstep of his own sounds slightly wrong on the way down, arriving back at his ears a fraction late, thinner than it left. He reached the Black River, wide and slow and giving back no reflection at all, and Karen looked at him the way Karen looked at every single soul that had ever stood on that bank, steady, unimpressed, entirely uninterested in anything except the coin that belonged under the tongue. Orpheus had no coin, because Orpheus had a pulse, and Karen had spent centuries turning away exactly this kind of visitor, without a second thought or a raised voice. So, Orpheus did the only thing he had ever known how to do when a door refused to open. He played instead of asking. Nobody had ever tried that particular fare before. The old ferryman, who had spent longer complaining about his boat's loading capacity than doing almost anything else in recorded myth, went completely still. The pole stopped tapping the riverbed, and for the length of one unbroken song, The black water lay flatter and quieter than it had lain in, longer than Charon himself could remember. He let him cross without a word. Cerberus met him at the gate, the way Cerberus met every soul heading in that direction, 3 heads low, a growl settling somewhere between warning and simple habit, that terrible tail beginning its slow, patient sweep across the ground. Orpheus played there too, softer this time, almost a lullaby, and the growl unwound into something closer to listening. The great dog lowered all 3 heads onto its paws at once, the way an ordinary dog settles by a fire on a cold night and let a living, breathing man walk straight past a threshold that had been built for exactly one purpose, which was to make that impossible. The song did not stop working once he was through the gate. If anything, the further in he went, the more it changed everything it touched. Word of a living man, moving through the meadow, reached the palace long before he did. It has never been a large kingdom for gossip, but the whole realm noticed a sound in it that had genuinely never existed there before. Not once in the entire span of its existence. Out on the gray plain, the drifting shades of asphodel, who forget almost everything eventually, who lose names and faces, and the shape of the lives they once carried, stopped drifting. For the length of the song, some of them are said to have looked, briefly, like they remembered something. Not a name, just a feeling underneath one. He came before the 2 thrones, and by then the entire hall had gone quiet in a way it had genuinely never gone quiet before. Not in the whole dark history of that palace Hades sat where he had always sat. Beside him Persephone, queen now in every sense that word carried in that kingdom, leaned forward slightly. The way you lean toward a sound you have not heard in far longer than you can actually measure. Orpheus did not plead first. He played first. He sang about the meadow, about a wedding that lasted exactly one afternoon, about a woman he had known completely and far too briefly, and about a version of forever that had been promised to both of them and then quietly taken back within a single season, the way a subscription gets canceled without anyone bothering to send the notice. Asterisk, the 3 judges, who between them had processed more souls than either could ever hope to count, stopped mid-case and simply listened. Neither Manas nor Rhadamanthus said one word for the length of the song, which had never once happened in the entire history of that court, and has never happened since. Out past the meadow, the sisters who hunt blood guilt and never rest for anyone were said, in the oldest tellings, to have wept. The only 3 beings in that entire kingdom who are not built to stop for grief, stopping anyway, tears running down faces that had never once shown mercy to a single soul that deserved it less. And in the pit below everything, the stone Sisyphus pushes forever sat motionless on the slope for the first time since the world had punished him. Tantalus, for one whole verse, did not reach for the water that always pulls itself away from him. Ixion's wheel slowed, and then, for the first time since it had started turning, it actually completely stopped. Asterisk, I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it might be the strangest and most tender detail in the whole of Greek myth. The one place in the entire universe built specifically around punishments that never ever end. And a single song made every one of them pause at once. Meaning is easier to find in that moment than almost anywhere else in this story. The song was never really about music. It was one grieving man asking the most immovable force in existence to make a single exception. Just this once, and the whole underworld, even the parts of it built deliberately never to bend for anybody, leaned in to hear exactly how he intended to ask. If you have ever bargained with something enormous and unmovable, a diagnosis, a decision already made somewhere far above your head, a door that had already closed before you got there, entirely over something you were nowhere near ready to let go of yet, you already know the exact shape of what he was doing in that hall. Asterisk. Hades listened to the whole thing without moving a single muscle. The old sources like to say he had never once wept in the entire span of his existence, and that this was the one night that finally broke the pattern. I cannot tell you whether that detail is literally true. I can tell you it is exactly the kind of detail that survives for 3,000 years precisely because everyone telling the story wants it to be. Asterisk. Perhaps something in it reached him more directly than it reached anyone else in that hall. He had, after all, spent longer inside a silence with no visitors than any being who has ever lived, and he alone in that room might have understood from the inside exactly what this man was asking permission to escape. Persephone spoke first, and what she actually said has not survived in any version we still have. Only that she turned to her husband and said something quiet, and he answered her with something quieter still. Then Hades looked at the musician standing in the middle of his own throne room and said yes. Eurydice's shade was brought forward from wherever the newly arrived wait their turn, and for one unbearable moment husband and wife stood close enough to almost touch, in a hall with no window and no proper light. 3 years and one entire kingdom apart from the meadow where all of this had started. There was, of course, a condition. There is always a condition in a place run on rules considerably older than the gods currently enforcing them. Walk ahead. Do not look back. Not once, not for a glance, not until both of you have fully returned to the world above, and the sun is genuinely on both your faces at the same time. It is worth pausing on why a rule like that would exist at all. In a kingdom that runs on nothing but trust, oaths, and the word a person gives once and is expected to keep, this was never really a test of love. It was a test of the one thing this entire realm was actually built on, the same thing that sent men to the pit for betraying a guest at their own table. Could a man be trusted to keep a promise when nobody down here was watching him keep it? Orpheus agreed before the sentence had even finished being spoken. Anyone would have. It sounds like the easiest promise in the entire world, right up until the moment you are the one who actually has to carry it. He turned, and he began to climb back the way he had come, past the gate where Cerberus lifted one head just to watch him go, back toward the black river where Charon was already waiting, pole in hand, as if he had somehow known this exact moment was coming. Behind him, unseen and almost entirely silent, Eurydice followed. He could not hear her footsteps. The dead do not make footsteps, not really. Only that thin, dry rustle the living mistake for wind, easy to lose completely under the sound of his own breathing, his own pulse going fast in his ears with every single step he took back up out of the dark dot. It is a very particular kind of terrible. walking forward while trying to be certain that someone is still behind you without once turning to check. If you have ever kept talking on a phone call through a bad signal, saying "Are you still there?" into a silence that refuses to answer either way, you already know a small, safe version of exactly what that climb felt like. The tunnel went on for a long way, longer than it had felt on the way down, the way any road always seems shorter walking towards something than it does walking away from it. The path narrowed in places and widened in others, and twice he heard what he was almost certain was a second set of feet finding their footing slightly behind his own, on stone that should not have made a sound for either of them. Twice he told himself that was exactly what it was, and kept walking, and did not turn his head even a fraction of an inch to check. 100 small doubts arrive on a climb like that, and none of them announce themselves as doubts. They arrive dressed as reasonable questions. What if the silence behind him only meant she was simply quiet by nature, the way she had always been quiet in life? What if the condition had never really been about trust at all, but about testing exactly how far a man could be pushed before his nerve finally gave out? He kept his eyes on the widening gray ahead of him, and he did not answer any of the questions, because answering them would have meant slowing down long enough to think, and thinking on that particular climb was the one thing he could no longer afford. Somewhere above them both, the last real daylight of the upper world was waiting, closer now with every single step, and completely, achingly silent behind him the entire way up, way up. He heard the tunnel start to open out ahead of him before he saw it. A change in the air first, warmer, moving again after all that stillness, and then, unmistakably, actual light, pale and gray and more beautiful than any light he had ever once bothered to notice. While he was still alive to take it for granted, he was almost there. One more turn, maybe 2 dots, and that is exactly the point at which certainty becomes the most dangerous thing a person can feel, he told himself. Afterward, in the only version of the story where he lived long enough to tell anyone anything, that he thought he had heard her stumble, that the silence behind him had changed shape for 1/2 of 1 second, and every instinct he had ever trusted told him to turn and catch her. He turned for 1 full heartbeat. He saw her exactly as she had been in the meadow, the light already reaching her face, her hand already lifting toward his dot. Then the light reached her a fraction too early, before the rule had been fully kept, and she was gone. Not slowly, not with any final words exchanged between them. She simply stopped being there, pulled back into the dark the way smoke gets pulled back into a closing door. And the last thing he heard, in every version anyone has ever dared repeat, was one word: farewell. He ran back down. Of course he did. He begged the Black River to let him cross a second time, and the ferryman who had once let a song move him refused, flatly, and did not budge again for 7 straight days. No matter what Orpheus played at that shore, some rules bend exactly once. That is usually the whole reason they bend at all. If you have ever gotten one single unrepeatable exception from someone, a landlord, a doctor, an airline at a gate, you already know precisely how it felt to stand at that river and understand the door was not simply shut. It had been shut on purpose, and this time, permanently, he went back to the world above, and he never really finished coming back. He played for a while. He stopped keeping company with anyone who might replace her, refused, according to most versions, in a way that eventually cost him his life at the hands of women who took the refusal personally and did not treat it gently. But that is where the story earns its place in this particular topic. On a night meant for the mortals who dared to go down and actually returned, because his shade did return in the only way that mattered by then. He crossed the Black River again, this time with a coin properly waiting under his own tongue, and on the far bank, in a meadow inside a kingdom that no longer had any rules left to enforce against the two of them, he found her. They are said to walk together in that gray field now, side by side, and for once neither one of them has to walk in front. Not every mortal who went down there went looking for someone they had lost. Some went looking for something they had never once been owed. Theseus had spent his whole life collecting the kind of reputation that makes a man forget where his luck actually runs out. He had slain a bull-headed monster in a maze that ate anyone else who wandered in. He had cleared roads of bandits nobody else could clear. By the time he was fully grown, half of Greece considered him something close to untouchable, which is exactly the condition under which most heroes make their worst decision. His friend was Pirithous, king of a rough hill people called the Lapiths, and the two of them had the specific, contagious confidence of friends who talk each other into things, usually somewhere around midnight, that neither one would ever have attempted alone. Both were widowers, or as good as, and both, somewhere in that midnight arithmetic, decided they deserved wives worthy of gods. Theseus set his sights absurdly high, and helped his friend steal a Spartan princess, still too young for marriage, which is its own dark footnote in his story, and not one this channel is going to linger on. And Pirithous, not to be outdone, decided he wanted nothing less than a bride who was already a queen, Persephone. He said it. Apparently, the way men say the boldest thing in the room after enough wine, certain the sheer audacity of the plan was proof of how well it would work. Theseus, to his enormous and lasting discredit, agreed to help him. They went down through the same cave at Teneron that had swallowed Orpheus's grief a generation earlier, walked the same black bank, crossed on the same complaining ferry, and this time Charon did not stop them either, because two living, overconfident kings marching in armed and announcing their intentions apparently did not read to him as anything worth the argument. They reached the palace and, with a straightforwardness that still reads as almost impressive in its stupidity, told Hades exactly what they had come for. Now, consider the position that put him in. This was not a stranger reaching for one flower in a field. This was two armed mortals walking into his own hall and stating out loud in front of his wife that they intended to take her. He did not raise his voice. Every account agrees on that, and every account agrees on what he did instead, which was somehow worse. He offered them a seat. 2 stone thrones, carved straight out of the palace floor, comfortable enough, gracious enough. Exactly the kind of hospitality that a guest in that hall had every right to expect, and the moment they sat down, the stone simply never let go again. Not chains. Not a spell they could see or fight. Their own bodies refusing to rise, held by rock that had apparently been waiting the entire time for 2 guests foolish enough to need it. The old sources call it the chair of forgetfulness, and the punishment was not pain. It was worse than pain in the particular currency this whole kingdom traded in. Their memories began to soften at the edges. Names slipped first, small ones, the names of servants back home, then larger ones, a mother's face, the sound of a specific street at a specific hour. The reason they had come slipped hardest of all, until neither man could have told you, if you had asked, exactly what he had been so certain he deserved. If you have ever walked into a room and completely lost the thought that sent you there, standing in a kitchen doorway, groping for something that was perfectly clear 10 seconds earlier, you have felt the smallest, most harmless cousin of what that chair did to two kings for years at a stretch, without ever once loosening its grip. I keep circling back to the same idea in this kingdom, and here it is again in its sharpest form yet. This was never a monster's dungeon. This was a very exact, very patient answer to a very specific crime, the same crime that fills the pit below everything else down here. Somebody had been offered a seat at a table and had repaid it by reaching for something that was never theirs to take. Persephone, for her part, wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She had a kingdom of her own to run for half of every year, judges to consult, souls to receive. And two men had just walked into her hall, assuming she was a prize to be divided between an argument and a wine-fueled promise made at midnight. If there is a small, satisfying justice tucked inside this story, it is that the men who came to steal a queen were undone by a punishment neither of them saw coming, dreamed up by the household they had just insulted. Years passed for them in that chair, possibly longer than either could have counted, had counting still been something either of them was capable of. And then, one ordinary day in that kingdom, a much larger problem walked in through the gate. Heracles, by then the most famous mortal alive. Midway through the 12 labors, a jealous king named Eurystheus, U-R-I-the-us, had assigned him as penance for a crime committed in a fit of madness that was never, by any fair account, entirely his own fault. The 12th and final labor was the one Eurystheus had genuinely believed impossible. When he handed it down, the way a manager sometimes assigns an outcome specifically hoping to watch it fail. Bring back the hound of the underworld, alive. Heracles went down through Tanneron, the same way everyone in this story goes down, and reached the Black River. And here is where his story splits cleanly from Theseus and Pirithous, in exactly the one detail that matters most. He asked. He stood in that same hall, in front of the same 2 thrones, and instead of announcing an intention, he made a request, plainly. The way you ask a neighbor before borrowing something rather than simply taking it and hoping nobody minds. He explained the labor. He explained the king who had said it. He did not threaten, and he did not demand. Hades, who had spent an uncountable span of centuries watching mortals arrive with entitlement dressed up as courage, appears to have recognized the difference immediately. He said yes, on one condition: no weapons. Whatever happened between Heracles and that dog would happen with nothing but 2 hands and whatever nerve he had left, and whatever nerve he had left. Cerberus did not go quietly. 3 heads, a mane of moving serpents, a strength built for exactly this kind of confrontation. And Heracles wrestled him the old way, arms locked around a neck the size of a ship's mast, absorbing bites from all three sets of jaws at once, and refusing to let go until the great dog finally, grudgingly, stopped fighting. He came away from that fight scarred in a dozen places, breathing hard against fur that smelled of cold stone and something underneath, the stone that had no name in any language spoken above ground, and he did not once complain about it afterward, which by his own standards was practically a miracle on its own. He carried him up through the tunnel, out through Tanneron, into daylight the dog had genuinely never once seen in his entire existence, and delivered him straight to the court of the king who had assigned the labor, expecting never to see either of them again. Eurystheus took one look at the actual hound of the dead standing in his own courtyard and did not handle it well. He is said, in several accounts, to have leapt straight into a large storage jar and refused to come out until the animal was gone, which remains one of the more quietly funny images to survive from the entire heroic age. A king who wanted proof of an impossible feat, and then could not tolerate being handed it. And then, in the detail that actually matters more than the labor itself, Heracles did the one thing almost nobody in this whole topic managed to do. He kept his word. He carried Cerberus straight back down through the tunnel, returned him to the gate, and handed the leash, so to speak, back to a god who had trusted him with it in the first place. While he was down there completing that errand, he found two old thrones with two very old, very diminished men still sitting in them, memories worn thin as river stone, barely able to say why they had ever come. He pulled Theseus free. The stone let go for him, the way it apparently never would have let go on its own, and the old sources are oddly specific that something was left behind in the effort, some small permanent cost paid by Theseus's own body for the years he had spent glued to that seat. When he reached for Pirithous, the ground itself refused. Every account agrees on this part. The earth shook once hard, and Heracles stepped back and understood, the way you understand a door that is not merely locked but was never meant to open again. For you specifically, some crimes get a second chance. Reaching for another god's wife, it turns out, is not one of them. Pirithous is still there, as far as any story ever told has claimed otherwise. He has never once left that chair. Theseus went home changed, quieter than the reputation that had gone down into that cave with him, and the myths that follow him afterward carry a noticeably different weight. A man who had been given back his life once, and seemed to know it down in that hall. Hades settled back onto a throne that had barely gone cold since the last visitor left it, and out past the meadow, at the edge of a black river that never once stopped moving, another small shape was already waiting on the near bank for a boat that would come for it eventually, the way it always did, whether anyone up in the daylight had noticed that particular soul was missing yet or not. An old woman died on an ordinary Tuesday, if Tuesdays had existed yet, in a small house near a river that is not any of the 5 we have already named, and nobody remarkable was there to see it happen. She had lived a long life, unspectacular by any measure a historian would bother recording, and she arrived on the near bank of the black water, the way most people arrive there, quietly, a little confused, looking for someone who was supposed to meet her. There was no fire waiting for her, no accusation, only the same gray light that had waited patiently For every ordinary soul who had ever come before her, her coin was in place. Her family had seen to that properly. Karen took one look at her, the way he had looked at every soul for longer than memory reaches, and made room in the boat without a word. She crossed. She met the dog, who lifted a head and let his tail move, the way he had for every ordinary arrival, for as long as there had been arrivals to greet. She stood in a short, unhurried line, and a man who had once been a king of Crete looked at the shape of her whole life for perhaps a minute, and sent her on to the gray field where nearly everyone eventually goes. Nobody screamed. Nobody burned. Nothing chased her across that meadow with a pitchfork or a grin, full of teeth. That is the underworld almost every single person who has ever died actually experienced. And it is worth saying plainly, because it is almost never the version anyone tells. Ask a person on the street today what Hades is like, and most of them will describe something closer to a Christian idea of hell, wearing a Greek name. A trickster, a schemer plotting against his own brother from some smoking throne, delighting in suffering, the villain of the piece, waiting for his moment to seize a world that was never his to take. None of that is who he actually was to the people who invented him. Consider for a moment what his brothers were doing with their own considerably more glamorous kingdoms during these same centuries of story. Zeus spent his reign chasing mortal women across the landscape in a startling variety of disguises, fathering children he mostly forgot about, striking down anyone who annoyed him with the nearest available thunderbolt, and punishing a titan named Prometheus by chaining him to a mountain to have his liver eaten by an eagle. Every single day forever for the crime of helping human beings stay warm. Poseidon flooded cities in fits of temper, turned a priestess into a monster because a rival god had wronged her in his own temple, and held grudges against entire bloodlines for offenses committed by someone's great-grandfather, and Hades, ruling the one kingdom every single culture on earth has always been most afraid of, spent those same centuries doing paperwork, sorting arrivals, keeping a boundary, handing moral judgment to 3 former mortal kings rather than trusting his own temper with it, because he understood, better than either of his brothers ever managed to, exactly how much damage an angry god with unchecked power could do to people who never had any say in the matter. If you have ever worked with someone who has every reason to throw their authority around and simply never does, you already know how rare that particular restraint actually is. In gods and in people both, he is, by a wide margin, the most faithful husband in the entire Greek pantheon. Not the most romantic story, not the most passionate, but once Persephone sat on that second throne, there is no surviving myth, not one, in which he wandered. Compare that to a father-in-law who fathered children with nymphs, mortals, and at least one cloud disguised as a woman, sometimes within the same decade, and you start to notice which brother actually behaved like family was worth protecting. He almost never left his kingdom. That detail gets skipped past constantly, and it might be the single clearest piece of evidence for who he really was. Zeus was constantly on the surface, meddling, seducing, punishing, showing off. Poseidon surfaced wherever a coastline needed rearranging. Hades stayed exactly where his job was for the entire span of Greek myth, with only a small handful of recorded exceptions, and even those were brief, purposeful. and quickly finished. A god who rarely leaves his post is not the same shape as a villain. Villains want attention. Villains want the story to be about them. He wanted none of it and got, instead, every dark suspicion an audience could invent for the one character willing to stay offstage. Even his own name reflects it. The Greeks so rarely said Hades aloud that softer names crowded it out almost entirely in daily use, and the one that stuck hardest was Plauton, the rich one, Pluton, the same root that gives modern languages the word for wealth itself, not because he hoarded gold in some dragon's vault beneath the earth, though later ages loved to imagine exactly that, because everything of value that a human being ever pulled up out of the ground, grain, silver, the copper for a blade, the clay for a roof over a family's heads, technically belonged first to him. He was not the god of taking life away in the oldest religious sense. He was the god of everything the earth generously gives back. Some cult sites even addressed him as Zeus of the underworld. Katachthonios, Kataklinios, a title that tells you plainly how the Greeks actually filed him in their own minds, not the opposite of the king of the gods. A second version of the exact same kind of authority, ruling a different, necessary half of the same complete world. There is a meaning worth sitting with inside that, and it rarely gets said out loud in the versions of this story most people grow up hearing. A civilization that genuinely believed a god was evil does not swear its most binding oaths on a river that belongs to him. It does not entrust him with the one court in existence where a king and a beggar are finally measured by the exact same scale. It does not whisper his other name, the hospitable one, into a culture built entirely around how you treat a stranger at your own table. You do not hand your most sacred promises to somebody you actually believe is your enemy. So where did the villain actually come from, if not from the Greeks themselves? Look at what happened to his name centuries after the last Greek priest ever poured wine into the ground for him, when later translators sat down to render old Hebrew scripture into Greek, and later still into the emerging language of the early Christian church. They needed a word for the shadowy realm of the dead that older Jewish tradition had always called Sheol, a vague, quiet place with no clear moral sorting built into it at all. The nearest Greek word sitting on the shelf was Hades, so they used it. Then, as Christian theology developed its own sharper, much more dramatic picture of eternal punishment for the wicked, that borrowed word came along for the ride and slowly picked up every fiery, tormenting idea that later theology piled onto it, none of which had existed in a single line of actual Greek myth. A quiet gray field of half-remembering shades became, in the popular imagination centuries later, a lake of fire. A god who ran a fair and sordid court became, by simple association of address, its warden. Early Christian writers, meanwhile, had their own reasons to want the old gods looking sinister. A new faith spreading through a world still full of altars to Zeus and Hades, and everyone else has an obvious use for turning the previous management into villains. And more than a few church writers describe the old pantheon outright as demons wearing borrowed names, actively worth being afraid of, rather than simply retired. None of that was really about Hades. It was about clearing shelf space for a new set of stories, using the furniture of the old ones. He got cast as a landlord who had never actually done anything, evicted from his own reputation by a dispute that had nothing to do with him. And then, many centuries after that, popular storytelling finished the job in its own casual way. A film or a cartoon needs a villain, and a god whose entire domain is dark and underground and guarded by a very large three-headed dog makes an easy, visually obvious choice, whatever the old scripts actually said about his character. Nobody making those choices was being cruel on purpose. They were simply reaching for the nearest shape that already looked the part. Somewhere in that long chain of borrowing, translating and simplifying, a careful, restrained, rule-bound administrator turned into a scheming villain. And almost nobody along the way stopped to check the original file dot. It is a very human thing, doing that to a person's reputation. Decide early what kind of character somebody is, usually based on where they happen to stand or what job they happen to hold, and then read every single thing they do afterward as further proof of a decision you had already made before you ever really looked. You have probably watched that happen to somebody in your own life. In a much smaller way, the manager who gets blamed the moment anything goes wrong, purely because managing is the job people distrust on sight. The quiet coworker everyone assumes is judging the room when they are actually just tired. Reputation, once it calcifies, stops needing new evidence. It only needs a place to file whatever happens next. Look again with all of that in mind at what he actually did with the power nobody else ever wanted to hold. He never freed a soul from the pit early. Not even once, not even when it would have cost him nothing and pleased everybody watching. He let a musician's grief move him exactly as far as the rules of his own house allowed, and not 1 inch further, even though it clearly would have been easier and kinder in the moment to simply bend. He punished 2 kings for reaching for his own wife with a chair instead of a blade. And he still, when a stranger asked for his dog honestly, instead of stealing him, said yes. Fairness, consistently applied, in a job with absolutely no witnesses ever checking your work, is one of the least dramatic virtues a storyteller can hand a character. It rarely gets you remembered as a hero. It has apparently, across 3,000 years, been more than enough to get you remembered as something considerably worse. There is a quieter truth sitting underneath all of it, one the farmers who actually worshipped him understood far better than any later storyteller ever bothered to. Every single grain of wheat that ever fed a Greek household began its life buried, dark, silent, underground, in soil that technically belonged to him before it ever belonged to anyone standing in daylight. Nothing grows without first spending time in exactly the kind of dark this god had ruled since before the mountains had names. That is not a coincidence, a culture built by accident. It is closer to the oldest idea people ever had about death itself, quietly folded into the one god brave enough, or unlucky enough, to be handed the job of holding it. Not an ending working against life. A depth life has always needed to pass through first. If you have ever planted something, even something small, a single pot on a windowsill, you already know the strange patience that requires. You bury a thing that looks, for all the world, like it is simply gone, and you wait in a darkness you cannot see into, trusting a process you were never shown and never fully control. and only much later does anything green come back up to prove the waiting was worth it. The Greeks built an entire religion around exactly that patience, and they put the most feared god they had in charge of guarding it. There is one more place this idea shows up most clearly of all: a single hillside temple where an entire city once lined up, year after year, for a promise about exactly this kind of darkness, and what waits quietly on the other side of it, a promise that, unlike almost everything else people believed about this god, they were careful never to get wrong. Eleusis sat a short walk from Athens, close enough that on a clear morning you could see its rooftops from the high rock of the Acropolis, and for close to 2,000 years an unbroken line of ordinary people walked that road, every autumn hoping to be let inside. The temple itself was the one Demeter had demanded built with her own hands, still shaking from 9 days spent searching for her daughter, raised for her by a household that had no idea, until the moment her disguise finally came off in their own nursery. Exactly who they had been sheltering. Here is the detail about that temple that tends to get skipped past, and it might be the single most telling fact in this entire story. Almost every sacred rite in the ancient world had a gate somewhere on it. Only free citizens, only men, only certain bloodlines, certain cities, certain accents. Eleusis had almost none of that. A farmer could be initiated beside a general. A slave could be initiated beside the household that owned her. Women stood in that hall on entirely equal footing with men, at a moment in history when almost no other public setting anywhere in Greece offered women that same equal footing. The only people turned away at that gate were those who had committed murder and never been cleansed of it, and those who could not speak Greek well enough to understand the rite. Everyone else, rich or poor, freeborn or enslaved, Athenian or foreign, queued on exactly the same ground, for exactly the same promise. Think about what that tells you about the God waiting at the far end of that promise. A religion that genuinely believed its underworld ruler played favorites, rewarded the powerful, punished the poor simply for being poor, does not build its one truly democratic ceremony around getting into his good graces. It builds walls. This one, alone among nearly everything else the Greeks practiced, built a gate wide enough for absolutely everyone to walk through. The procession itself left Athens each autumn along what the Greeks simply called the Sacred Way, thousands of initiates and their families moving together over some 14 miles of open road, myrtle branches in hand, a wooden image of the boy god Iacchus carried at the front, while the whole column called his name aloud in a chant that echoed off the hillsides for hours. They stopped partway to bathe piglets in the sea and offer them, dropped coarse jokes at a particular bridge, crossing in memory of an old woman said to have once made a grieving Demeter laugh on this very road, and arrived at Eleusis itself only after nightfall, exhausted, torches lit, the temple doors finally opening onto whatever waited inside. We know the shape of it from there, even without the details filled in. A period of fasting beforehand, a shared drink called the kykeon, its exact recipe as carefully guarded as everything else about that night, and somewhere inside in a great candlelit hall built for this single purpose alone, the initiates witnessed something that every surviving writer who mentions it describes only through the weight of their own reaction, never through what they actually saw. Ancient writers who were permitted to speak of it had all agreed on one thing above every other. Whatever waits after death, it goes easier for those who have been shown the truth of it here, tonight, in this exact hall. Not immortality. Nobody promised anyone an escape from dying. Every soul that walked out of that torchlit chamber still had precisely one appointment left to keep, with the same God this whole night has quietly been about. What Eleusis promised, instead, was something quieter, and in its own way considerably braver than any promise of an escape could ever have been. A gentler passage through his kingdom, not around it. Through it, sit with that for a moment, because it might be the whole argument of tonight, folded into a single sentence. When the ancient world reached for its highest hope, the greatest comfort it knew how to offer a frightened human being, standing at the edge of everything, it did not promise anyone a way to dodge Hades. It promised them a better welcome inside his hall. You do not build your civilization's most sacred hope around escaping a monster. You build it around trusting a king to treat you fairly when your own turn finally comes. Every single person walking that torchlit road toward Eleusis, once a year for 2,000 years, was quietly making exactly that bet, on exactly that God. There is a difference worth drawing carefully here, because it is the difference this whole topic has been circling since the first line of it. Being afraid of a thing is not the same as believing that thing is evil. People have always been afraid of storms, and nobody built a religion accusing the sky of malice. People have always been afraid of the sea, and Poseidon still got his temples on every coastline in Greece, offered freely, without this particular nervousness attached. Death earns a fear that has nothing to do with morality at all. It is simply the one appointment no living creature gets to reschedule, the one door every single person walks toward, whether they have been good or careless or simply ordinary. And a healthy fear of that inevitability is not the same accusation as calling the door's keeper wicked. The Greeks were careful, in nearly everything they left behind, to keep those two fears separate. They flinched from death. They rarely accused the god of causing it. That distinction is exactly the one later century eventually lost, folding a natural, sensible fear of dying into an entirely different fear of damnation that this particular god never once actually represented. You can see the older, more careful fear still in the small everyday habits Greek households kept around him. When a family prayed to him, they turned their faces away rather than lifting them to the sky, because his realm was beneath their feet and their prayers traveled downward instead of up. They struck the flat of their hands against the ground to be sure he heard them under all that earth. Their sacrifices to him used black animals rather than white, offered at night rather than at noon, poured out with the head turned aside rather than eaten afterward at a shared table, the way every other god's portion was. None of that reads as hatred. It reads as the exact careful etiquette you would use with someone enormously powerful, whose good opinion genuinely mattered to you, and whose realm you had no wish to visit even a single day sooner than necessary. You do not develop careful etiquette for an enemy. You develop it for someone whose respect is worth keeping. Persephone stood at the center of that. Eleusis right every bit as much as her mother did. and her part in it tells you something worth carrying home tonight. The seed goes into the dark ground and seems to disappear completely. Then, on its own schedule, never rushed, never explained to the farmer waiting above it, it comes back up green. The rite showed the initiates exactly that promise. Wrapped in the shape of a goddess who had once been dragged into the ground herself and returned every single spring, exactly on time, having chosen, by every account we ever hear of her after that first year, to keep going back down again. She was never reduced in that temple to only a victim to be pitied. She stood there as proof that the descent does not have to be the end of the story, and that a return is always, eventually, part of the arrangement. A god who had once caused her worst year became, in the same religion, the reason her return meant anything at all. You cannot have a joyful spring without a genuine winter underneath it. And the Greeks, unlike most of what came later, never once pretended otherwise. Later thinkers, writing long after the old temples had gone quiet, began describing this whole kingdom less as a punishment waiting at the end of a life, and more as a kind of necessary unmaking. The dark the soul passes through on its way to whatever comes after. The same way grain has to be broken down completely before anything resembling bread can exist. Death, in that reading, stopped being an enemy of life and became something closer to its other half. The half nobody wants to look at directly, doing work that the bright half could never manage on its own. That is not a comforting idea in the loud, easy way modern comfort usually gets sold. It is comforting the way this entire channel tries to be, quietly, without asking you to pretend the dark isn't real. The dark is real. It has simply never been the villain everyone assumed it was. There is a shape sitting underneath every topic we have covered tonight, and it deserves one plain sentence before we let him go. He was the one member of this entire family who never once had to be taught what patience actually costs, because by the time anyone else in that family had learned the word, he had already been paying that particular price longer than the rest of them combined. Go back, if you can hold it loosely in your mind for just a moment, to the very beginning of tonight. Before any kingdom, before any lottery or any war or any wife, a newborn god minutes old, wrapped in wool that still remembered the animal it came from, swallowed whole into a dark with no edges, making no sound at all, while everyone standing around him assumed the silence meant something had gone wrong. It never did. That silence was simply the first thing he was ever good at. The same stillness carried him through an age with no light in it at all. It carried him through a war he had to win invisibly, because a helmet of shadow was the only gift anyone ever thought to make for him. It was there the night a division of the whole universe landed in his hands anyway, dressed up politely as a lottery. And it was there, unchanged, centuries later, the night a grieving musician's song made an entire pit full of the eternally punished stop and listen. Just once, before returning to their work, he was never the villain of any of this. He was simply the one god willing to sit with a part of existence that everyone else found too frightening to hold. And he held it steadily, without an audience, for exactly as long as anyone has ever bothered to tell a story. If you have ever done something difficult and necessary that nobody around you ever properly thanked you for, quietly, correctly, over and over, with no one keeping score, You already know something true about him that most of history managed to miss completely, somewhere below the world tonight. Whether anyone up here in the light remembers to think about it or not, that same quiet is still holding. Exactly the way it always has. The Black River is still turning its 9 slow coils around the whole kingdom, giving back no reflection to anyone standing at its edge. The ferryman is still out on the water somewhere, muttering about the weight of his own boat to nobody in particular, the way he has for longer than any calendar has ever tried to measure. The dog is still lying at the gate, with 3 heads at 3 different angles, tail moving for whoever is arriving, perfectly still for anyone foolish enough to try leaving early Dot out on the gray meadow. The flowers that ask for nothing are still growing in soil that would support nothing else, and the ordinary dead are still drifting through them the way clouds drift, unhurried, unbothered, finally, impossibly, at rest. Far off past the meadow's edge, a dark palace with no adjectives worth writing down is still standing exactly where it has always stood, and inside it, past a hall that has heard more grief than any room in the history of the world, 2 thrones are still occupied, side by side, exactly the way they have been for longer than either of them probably still bothers counting. He is still there, steady, unhurried, doing the one job nobody else in that entire family was ever built to hold, quietly, correctly, for an audience that mostly never even remembers to say thank you. And somewhere far above all of it, in a small, warm room with the lights already low, someone tonight is finally letting go of whatever they were holding on to today, drifting off exactly the way this whole night was built to help them do, down into a small, safe, borrowed version of that same patient dark, the one that was never, in its entire history, anybody's enemy at all.